Okay, so we're gonna pick up a little bit where we left off, and then we're gonna move into talking about some elements of copyright. They're gonna be super important. But first, before we begin, welcome back. I have thank you for the papers from Braden and Amy, and via email, I have a few. Looks like I have Bianca and Nicholas, and later on when I get a moment, we'll log into Canvas and see what came in through there. Should have a few going on there. Good. Okay. Yeah. So those look good. Thank you. Hopefully, when you guys had a chance to sit down and do these, thank you. They were somewhat enlightening, and they spoke to some of the area that you want to go into. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about income sources from songwriting, and then we're going to discuss like the big deal, which is copyright. And the copyright essentially is, I mean, in reality, the really big deal about the copyright is whoever owns the copyright owns the money. And I hate to like take you roundabout any other way than to just basically say, music is business. If you're doing it for survival or a lifestyle, unless you're already rich and you don't need the money, right? And so, because of that, a lot of what we're going to talk about today really does center around the money, and the purpose for a lot of what you're going to see in the legalities are really based upon making sure that we get the most out of our work. The first image you see here, though, kind of just talks about, where does the money even come from when we have a piece of music to work with in the music business. And what's really interesting about this is that once we get into talking about the PROs, or the performing rights organizations, you'll see how big of a role that they play. But last week, I think last week was the first time I mentioned to you guys how long it takes to get paid. Does anybody remember that conversation?
A year?
Yeah, almost. How much was it? How long was it?
I thought it was a year. Like literally.
No,
90 days, a quarter?
90 days past the close of the quarter, which is technically 6 months. 6 months. But in the life cycle of something, most of the time, like for new artists, what you'll see in a new artist scenario is this. In the cycle of an album or a single, you literally, let's try. Come on, no juice? Okay, no juice here. It literally will look like this. Up and then down, right? In the life of a new artist. For established artists, it's really stacked really high towards the front end, and then it slopes down. So it's good for them. 90 days past the quarter means, in 6 months they're getting real good money. For new artists, or even artists that aren't new but just aren't really extremely well established, it's going to take a year to 2 years to see the really good part of the money. Does that make sense? So the good part of the money doesn't come around until that particular time. So what do they do in the meantime? And it's off the board here, income from a recording. What do they do in the meantime? What do you think? Make music, tour. Yeah, have live performances, special appearances, all that kind of stuff, right? In this particular scheme you can see, they're collecting revenue from broadcasters, which is radio, clubs, hotels. This is the PRO group right here, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC. We haven't talked about that yet, but you see in the middle, you have the writer and the publisher. Last week we talked about publishing, and then we also talked about songwriting. Even the week before we talked about, the week before we talked about publishing, and after that we talked about songwriting. So let's talk about the publisher side. How many publishers are we allowed to have? And is there a limit? Yeah, anybody? How many publishers are we allowed to have, and is there a limit? You remember this?
One per publisher.
Yeah, you could have one publisher. How many are we allowed to have? As many as we want, technically, yeah. As many as fit inside of the scheme of the ownership. So if we all wrote a song and we all wanted to co-publish together with our own publishing brand, we could all do it together. What's the benefit of having one publisher? I mean, it would make more financial sense to have one publisher. What's the drawback to having one publisher? Do you remember this? those are your.
If they're not very good, your music doesn't get out there.
Yeah, well, it's not like you can say, "Hey, publisher, you're fired," right? We need a new publisher, right? Because when you sign the publishing deal, you sign over your rights to the publisher, and usually it's for a set term. In most cases, that set term is a long time, and it could be your entire lifetime. A lot of people sign that kind of publishing deal with major publishers, forgetting that even if it's a major publisher, why might they not be a good fit for that publisher? If it's like let's say I'm getting published through Universal, one of the biggest publishers in the world, why might not that be good for me as an artist? What's the drawback to that? Any thoughts on this?
If you're not a very established artist, then you're not going to be a priority to them.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing, but the publisher doesn't just sit there and collect money that comes from nowhere. The publisher has to market and promote your work in order for it to get in the hands of our people. Marketing from a publisher it can be as simple as meeting up with someone saying, "Hey, look, here's our portfolio. You have new artists that are about to record some albums. Can you take maybe a couple songs from our portfolio that we already have and put them on, pair them up with the right artist for you that's about to just do this major release?" It's as simple as a face-to-face conversation with either A&R reps or people that are representing an artist directly that would have some sort of power or pull to actually have an artist record them, which means it's a money generator. And then, of course, the other side of this spectrum, of course, is the writer. But that's why the publisher, you see in this split here, writer and publisher. Publisher is such a big part of this because obviously the writer has to generate the music or create the music in the first place, but the publisher is responsible for getting it out there. And that's why the way that this whole thing kind of goes here. And then you can see here this, if you follow it, publisher receives money, but then 50% of the mechanicals go back to the writer. Well, so like it kind of funnels, you see some of the funneling system going this way, which is good. Because if a publisher, let's say you're a publisher, right? Let's say you're a publisher and you get contacted and someone says, "Hey, someone on your portfolio, I want to record their song, I want to cover it on my album." You say, "Yeah, well, this is what the fee is." You collect the fee, you keep part of the fee, and then you send the rest of the fee as mechanical over to the writer. That make sense? Mm-hmm. So like you're the first stop for payment, and then the rest goes to the writer. Now this may not be one person, so this might go a lot of different ways. But the cool part about this is that sometimes you market it as a publisher, sometimes it just comes to you. So like if you, a great example, like if you want, it's kind of weird. Right now, July is the time, just if you didn't really know, and you might not care at all, July is the time that most artists step into the studio to record Christmas songs. And October is a big month for licensing. Because when do they want it ready to go? Right after Halloween, essentially. And in most cases, like if you're a large artist, your goal is to get your music into the Black Friday mix, the marketing push for Black Friday. In order to do that, though, you have to have a publisher that has essentially some sort of stake in that kind of market as a writer. So like you could be writing Christmas music all day, but the publisher has to get it to the artist in order to get it in the studio and published and ready and synced for the fall. So like that might happen as a push, but organically, if like let's say you just had like this amazing Christmas song that everybody wants to cover just naturally, then all those people just contact the publisher and say, "Hey, we want to do this. We'll pay the fee. Here it goes." Right? It's funny because there's a lot of jazz. I talked about this before. But there's a lot of jazz recordings that happen here in the studio, and there's a lot of standards that a lot of the people that record their jazz albums here on campus just kind of gravitate towards because they like them, and that's a very organic means for the publisher. So the downside to this, the scheme that you see here, is it doesn't actually show you what if the writer was the publisher. But in reality, if the writer was the publisher, which each of you could be as a writer if you were a writer, the writer can own their own publisher and be their own publisher. Which means the cool part is that everything you see here falls to both sides. And I mean, it literally just the one all-encompassing person. So it's funny because I know there's a band called Paper Route, and I went to college with them, and they were a completely different band then, but just like off the charts with like creativity and their overall sound, just at a really young age. But like they signed a major deal. They signed a really, really major deal, and it was with Universal. And after that deal fell through, and they got out of that deal, they immediately came on as their own publisher and realized that they don't ever want to give that away anymore. And there was this huge article about it. Or they didn't write it. They had an interview with this online magazine, and they wrote an article about it. But if you could kind of read about like why they decided like this, even if they made less money, would be more valuable to them in the big picture than signing this to a large entity and making more money overall, but yet having less control and having less ability with it. And that's the Harry Fox agency. Just remember, this is the publisher's agent. So like, if I'm a publisher, if I own a publishing company, and each of you, like technically, you guys could just go out and start your own publishing company. All I have to do is file a few forms. You can technically do it as a sole proprietor. A couple things you need to do though is you have to file it through the PRO. You have to file as a publisher. And when you file as a publisher through the PRO, you then can also register for the Harry Fox agency as a publisher. And all this is this was the clearinghouse. Remember that? We talked about this. We talked about this last week, didn't we? Or the week before? I showed you the website. I mean, it's literally a clearinghouse designed to just like get people in there and go. Like remember the website? The website basically said, "Want to record a cover? Hit this button." Right? And then you go hit that button and you're like, "Hey, I want to record, this Michael Jackson song." And you just type it in and it tells you this is the fee. And what they do is they just take that fee and they send it to the publisher. They take a little cut, right, for the management of it. And they send it to the publisher. It makes a nice, easy one-stop shop. But that's what that essentially is. And then, of course, you see here, video producers, film producers, record companies. Now, right now you see sync, sync, sync. I think that's it for sync, right? So sync, 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 license, license, performance royalty, right? And then you see mechanical, mechanical. Now, one more, mechanical, performance. When we're done with this whole thing, in the coming weeks, you'll be able to look at this and go, oh, I know the difference between a performance royalty, a mechanical, and a sync. Syncs are actually pretty easy, but understanding mechanical, we talked about this very briefly last week. The mechanical is anything physically sold, where the license is just like anything else. It's like a, oh, this is the last one here. Or maybe am I locked out? Yeah, there we go. Where the license is essentially anything that can be sold for short-term use. I'm going to jam through some of this. We talked about staff writing last week. Yes, sir.
Sorry, did you want to click the article?
Yeah. Actually, I had a bunch up here. Did anybody else have an article? I know some of you guys have. Very cool. I like it. These are actually awesome to read. Like these are, it's so cool to kind of read. Like more. I mean, actually more from your takeaway. Everybody has a different perspective on the stuff that they read. So I think those are always awesome. So thank you for those. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about this part. So soon we're going to talk. Once we talk contracts, we're going to talk about the dollar value of a contract. And when we talk about the dollar value of a contract, the part of it begins and ends with who's in it, right? Like it essentially, who's offering what, right? Like what are we leveraging in the process? What could it make over the course of 5 years? What could it make over the course of 10 years? In projection style, right? And then one of the elements there that comes with that is being able to evaluate specific entities or roles. So like evaluating the publishers from a writer's perspective, if you're given a record deal, so like if I said, hey, I'm going to go get a record deal as an artist, all right? Typical record deals will go with a record agreement, the recording agreement, and a publishing deal, hand in hand. And they can be two separate contracts signed at the same time, or it can technically be one contract with both elements involved, but preferably I always like to see it separate. Once it's in the same contract, it's hard to tell who's responsible for what in those entities, especially if they're owned by the same company. So like if you're signing a deal with Universal and then there's Universal Records and then there's Universal Publishing, separating who's supposed to be responsible for which part inside of that contract gets a little finicky. So I always tell artists like, hey, if it's going to come down and it's together kind of set, it's nice to always see them separately. So you can literally pick at one and go, I want these changes, and you can pick at the other and go, I like these changes. The other element about that, of course, is the ability to negotiate. But when you're trying to evaluate what the publisher has to offer, we have to ask a couple questions. And the biggest one is, essentially, what does the publishing company uniquely bring to the market that you need? I always tell artists, can you do it on your own? Right? It's always, can you do it on your own? Should you do it on your own? Right? Can you do it on your own? Should you do it on your own? And is there another brand, entity, company that would better fit you than the one that's pursuing you currently? There's a long time ago, I had a publishing company that was talking to me about some of my music. And my first question was, who are your other artists, right? Who's on your roster already? What kind of stuff demographically do you focus on? And what kind of audience do you already maintain? You know what I mean? Like, can you simply pick up a phone, make a call, have a network connection that opens the door for licensing? You know what I mean? Or is your publishing brand just a website? I mean, I made many websites in my time, and the first thing I learned about making websites is that it's awesome because most people who I know, when they make a website for the first time, they're like, oh, I don't want to publish it until it's ready. I can almost tell you now, the most amazing thing about websites is if you're not marketing it, you can publish it all day and no one's ever going to see it. Which is funny because you could put up the craziest website out there and no one will ever see it. There's no way to find it technically until it finds its way, right, organically to people that click it, and then all of a sudden it gets a ranking or a rating, and then it falls into the Google element, right? But when you're evaluating publishers, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, does the publisher is it just a website? Because there's a lot of publishers that literally are just a website. There's a lot of publishers that have a catalog. It's crazy. There's some publishers out there that have been around from your grandpa's era, just to be frank, and their catalog still resides on a shelf somewhere. It's not digital, right? There are plenty of publishers that never made the transition, that were at one time established publishers that can really move, product, but now they can't because they never made the turn. But for them, it's like they had enough money and they just really didn't need, find the need to make that transition. While you see other publishers which are just mega, rock stars in the realm, and they really know how to take it from, inception all the way to market, and then do that over and over and over and over again. So one of the things you have to look for is evaluating what a publisher offers. Are they really a publisher, or are they simply functioning as a collection agency? The difference is, and this is because I always had people that would go, because I've been doing a lot of stuff in the music business, and I always had a lot of people that say, well, why don't you make your own record label? And I'm like, I would, but you need money. And the record label, if I was to sum up the record label for you guys, and just say record label, one word, record label, bank, right? The record label is the money. Record label funds everything, right? They fund yours. As an artist, the goal is to let's say you work a different job. Okay, so I don't know, do you work a job? What do you do?
Retail.
Okay, retail. So I'm going to sign you as an artist. If I'm a real record label, first goal is get you to stop your job. Why? Because if I'm going to invest money in you, I don't want you worried about retail. What do I want you focused on? Right? I want you focused on your music. So they're going to fund, in the form of an advance, your ability to survive before the record gets released. So when you hear someone sign to $1 million record deal, question mark is always, where does the money go? What is that money, right? Because every deal has a money value, a monetary value, and that money value usually includes production, travel, it includes the whole 9 yards, marketing, and your livelihood for that period of time before you start actually receiving real money. That may only realistically, they may look at it and go, well, at your age and your stage of life, you only really need $35K to survive, right? Which isn't realistic, especially for those who go to Hollywood or LA and try to make their living there. They literally will go, well, this is what we set aside for you. It's not a lot. We're literally going to set aside $2,000 a month for you to survive. But as an artist, guess what? You can sell it. You can sell your car. You don't need a car. Why? Because you're going to be on the road, right? You don't really need a house because you're going to be on the road, right? So we'll get you a simple, cheap apartment that you're only going to use temporarily because you're going to be on the road, right? So their vision of how you're going to use money is a little different. But the value of that is they're actually going to fund, right, as a record label, they're going to fund something immediately, and they're going to have funds for all of it. When it comes to the publisher, okay, so the record label is the bank, okay? The publisher focuses on being your salesman. The record label does that a little bit. They still market in that kind of way,
But the record label is a short-term deal, and the publishing kind of deal is what? Long-term, which means they have to look at it and go, we're not only going to market you today, we're going to market you 20 years from now. So, excuse me. So, the question is if I go and do research on the publisher, do I see them actively promoting their artists? Do I see what they're doing with other artists? Does that make sense? Or are they a collection agency that's only riding on the coattails of what the record label did? So like if the record label comes in, does all the promotion, does all the marketing, funds all this stuff, and the publisher's just literally just sitting there collecting, you could do that as an individual. Like how hard is that for you to do? All you have to do is set up your company, it'll cost you less than $200 you can get established, and all of a sudden you're your own publisher that just does nothing but collect, right? Right, and even if you did, let's say you made it well, let's say you made it decent, you could then reinvest that money in spending on marketing for your own publishing company to sell you more, right? But realistically, a real publisher has to have legs. There has to be some goal. And I always tell artists, go look at the roster. Who's on the roster? How successful are they? Anytime, how many artists do I have in the room? I have some artists. Individual performers, musicians, composers, songwriters, anything in that realm? Okay. Anytime you go onto somebody's website and you immediately do not see professional photos of their artists, there's no deal. 100% there's no deal. All right? You understand that? Because you would only for a professional publishing agency specifically, for a professional record label, they would only hire real photographers to capture real. Holy cow. To capture real photos for the real artists, right? I've seen a lot of publishers, their website, go to their websites, and like everybody's up there with their own like selfies or them like in their backyard, and that's their photo. And it's like, okay, yeah, these are not, one, they're not real artists, which means whether that's today or tomorrow or 10 years from now, however long they've been on this ticket, they never were established as real artists, okay? Which means no one developed them or transitioned them to real artists, right? And that also means that everybody that's in that group that's working with them is probably literally just sitting on their hands. You know, I've been in plenty of situations where the record label said, what have you guys done on your own? And I always encourage that. So every artist or band that I ever work with, I say, look, record labels aren't desperate. I mean, they actually are, surprisingly. They're desperate for good artists. But they're not desperate for people who just want to sit around on their couch and just hope that someday someone's going to knock on their door and go, oh, hey, you've been doing nothing, but you have that one good song, so let's just sign you. And that's not how it works, because there's always a lot of footwork that has to be done by the artist. But the artist should never be responsible for, technically, the artist should not be responsible for having to go out there, make their own photos, make their own graphics, make their own look. That's not part of the deal, all right? Now, some artists elect to do that because they'll make more money doing that. If they just said, hey, I realize that if I hired my own photographer, then I don't owe the record label that money back because I'm paying for it. But that's how you would define a good publisher. You can just go onto their website and go, what do I see? If their website looks like it was written in the original HTML code from like the 1990s, then don't go, right? Don't make it. I had a student that brought me a contract last year. He's a good kid. And he said, hey, this is a contract I was just given. I was just offered. Oh, okay, well, did you meet any of the individuals that are involved in the contract? No, they emailed it to me. Okay, well, there's red flag number one. Okay, so in reality, if you're ever given a contract or contract opportunity, it's valuable enough for anybody to sign a contract to meet you face to face. If it has any dollar amount to it at all, right? Because why? Because how much do you think they're going to invest? Think about it. If I'm a publisher, how much would I be willing to invest in someone I never met? Right? Like how much money would I really be willing to give away to someone I never met? Give me a dollar value. What would make you feel comfortable with someone that you never met?
Nothing more than $10.
Yeah, maybe. Let's say you love their music. You were just a huge fan. I love their music, but I still never met them. What would the top dollar be? Because you still don't have a relationship there. Right? What would it would still end up at? I would say maybe at max. I'd say 200, but that's still pushing it, right? Which means that the publishing company, in reality, if you get a contract via email or get a contract via some other social site of someone you never met, even if there's a phone conversation, it's like they're not going to spend money on you. What they're going to do is they're going to lock you in a contract. And they're going to sit on their hands and they're going to say, all right, you go promote yourself, push yourself, and we'll collect it for you. there's a scheme on, well, it's a scheme, but I mean, it really is, for those who need it, it works, but there are agencies online that their whole goal is to collect revenue for artists from YouTube. But there's already agencies that collect YouTube royalties for artists. And those are the PROs. They were in the scheme that you saw there before. And the PROs are free, and they don't take anything off the top. They literally give you 100% of what you're owed. And there are agencies that are out there that just say, oh, well, we searched for the money that you didn't know was there. But in reality, all they're going to do is they're going to file some basic legalities that you could do on your own, and then they're going to charge you for it, right? So, I mean, it's almost like one of those, and you probably know quite a bit about this, one of those companies that you go onto their website and you pay for your business license, when you're paying, $1,000 for your business license, but you could have gone down to the, Clark County District and filed it for yourself for like $75, right? And that's just like the whole scheme. Anyway, in the evaluation process, I already mentioned these, but reputation's good. Leadership is always good. There's a key man clause we're going to talk about when we get to contracts. The leaders, just remember that any company is owned by either one individual or a group of people. And because it's always a business, when you sign over to it or have an artist sign over to it, or if you're the one that owns it and the artist signs over to it, there has to be an understanding of what happens if you sell, right? Like what happens if I sell my entire company, my clients or my artists or my people that are in contracts go with it, right? As an artist, a lot of times you're looking for some way of shielding yourself for at least an evaluation period of that transition, right? Instead of just saying, well, I don't have a choice, right? North Korea could come in and buy my publishing company and take my rights, right? I mean, they literally could do that, right? Unless there's some sort of terminology that allows for essentially the stopping or evaluation period for it. The long-term track record, I don't necessarily believe in long-term track records and like long-term track records, because only when we talk about the big record labels, you're going to see that over the last 30 years, it went from like having 15 major record labels to having 3 major record labels. And that's it. And all 3 of those major record labels own every subset of record label that exists. So like the problem with track records is you rewind 20, 30 years, there was a lot of activity going on, and every company that folded was either went into bankruptcy or was purchased. About 2 years ago, I knew some writers that were signed to a publishing company that totally got canned. The record label that owned them as a publishing company said, all of your sub-publishing companies that are associated with you we're getting rid of. And they literally just dissolved all the companies, which meant everybody's contract that was a physical contract literally just was gone, right? So, track record only means so much in the current day that we're in. But this is huge. Do they make money? Are they making money? How do they make money? Is their office like 2 people? Is their office like 10 people? How many people are going to be focused on my particular project? What's the future forecast for that, right? And then, this is the big one. Who in the company cares about you and your material? It's funny, I know another artist. He's not great, but boy, can he schmooze. And everybody this guy meets, he totally sells on who he is and what he does, even if it's not great. And I always constantly see him out there performing, and it's still so bad, but every time he finds a new company to make something work with, he finds someone in that company that cares about his material. I'll be honest, it's almost always exclusively a chick, or a female, because he's a guy, and he's good at schmoozing. He's really good at schmoozing with the ladies. So all he does is just, kind of finds a little person in that business. Before you know it, he's got investors. Before you know it, he's out performing, right? Eventually it runs dry, and then he moves on to the next thing. There's that. It's sad because there's lots of problems with that. And one of the biggest problems that I see is he's wasting his time. If he focused on being better at his talent instead of the schmoozing business part, he'd probably actually do very well, and he wouldn't have to keep jumping around. But the really funny part about that is this is a huge deal. Who in the company cares about you and your material? Now, how many of you guys have ever been in a meeting? Now, you guys are young for the most part, so you may not have ever had this experience. But I've had a lot of jobs where they put you in a room, and they literally go around the room and they ask you about your clients. And they're like, how are your clients doing? Who are your clients? What kind of what kind of value do your clients bring to the company? It's the same thing with artists. Like these guys, these are businesses at the end of the day. So these guys get thrown into a room and go, all right, who's on our publishing roster and what are they doing for us right now? If they wrote music 10 years ago, that's great, but how do we make that fly for us today, right? Which means someone has to look at it and go, oh, I believe that if we do something with it, we'll make money. Otherwise, it's on the shelf, right? It's retired. It's just out. That's the unfortunate, danger of the future of music, is that a lot of it is very focused on the short-term sell. And if you think about like how the type of music that people like to cover, a lot of times is music that's a little more universal and it has like flexibility. You can play it on an acoustic guitar, you can play it on a kazoo, you can do all sorts of different things with it. So like when we go to electronic music, and it started as electronic music, hard part about it is people are going to want to cover it in a non-electronic form, and if it translates, it's sellable in the future. If it doesn't translate, it's not very easily sellable in that kind of format. Which means it may get retired, and there's a lot of stuff that's that kind of way. You never really hear anybody covering like a Rod Stewart B-side, you know what I mean? You probably don't even know what a Rod Stewart B-side is, if you heard it. I have a huge record collection, and I have a lot of artists that I like to listen to, and I'll go pull a record, and guess what? There's only one song on there that I've ever heard. You know what I mean? Like ever. You know what I mean? Like artists that I know, because from back in the day, they would release one good song, and everything else was almost totally not reasonably interesting, or didn't sound or fit the mold. So like they're not, as a publisher, they're not out there throwing out all those other songs to promote. Even if you think about it as just an artist, you only have one hit. That they're gonna love that one hit. That's the only one they're gonna focus on. They're not gonna focus on all your other songs, right? So someone has to care about you. This one's hard. This is why people in the business still do stuff. Like this is why people like major artists in the business are still out there, right? If you wondered why they're still out there, it's like, man, that guy could retire any day. Yeah, but he realizes if he's out there and he can get his people in the publishing realm to just keep with him, like even if it just means playing a show here or there, going out, and sometimes just going out and being social and making that connection, he'll make millions more dollars each year just by having that kind of direct connection with these people. Otherwise, what's the word? Out of sight, out of mind, gone, right? And resources are important. If your songs hit, does the company understand the print business and the licensing options? So this one's I didn't know this until I started doing more of it, but like the print business, right now, when it changed over to digital, there was a transitional period where you could just go online and go, hey, I want the music for such and such a song. You go type it in, you find a PDF like that. Now, it's like really hard. Now it's really hard. Like you go find chord charts, but you couldn't find notated music arrangements for your favorite songs because they're all like very securely locked up by companies that sell it. So the only way you gain access to it is by selling it. And what they've done now in our future element of where they are, they used to just say, oh, you can buy it as a PDF. So you buy it and download it as a PDF. Well, what happens if you have it as a PDF? What can you do with it?
Email it.
Yeah, you could share it. You could just literally just put it back out there. And that's why a lot of it was accessible. All the new print companies make you download an app, right? And they make you use that app as your license means of always establishing that you have a license for that particular music. So you can print it and make copies, but you can't just take the digital version and go send it to somebody else. You know what I mean? Because as soon as you try to send it to somebody else and they open it, it realizes, oh, this isn't licensed, right, in this particular location with this particular user. So all of a sudden there's a blocking for it. So like print music has actually increased in security, which means that it's making more money right now than it had been before. There's a couple other things like licensing abroad, which is important. We talked about that, digital usage, stuff like that. So I'm going to skip the Songwriters Guild. There is such a thing as a Songwriters Guild of America. The Songwriters Guild used to be super important. Now it really struggles because just like any other it almost feels like a union, but it's not necessarily. it requires that whoever signs you or works with you actually honors these particular rules, which in the modern day, a lot of record labels are just not super interested in. So like the Songwriters Guild is a place that you could join and be a part of, but a lot of times, to be honest, like a lot of people kind of shy away from the use of the Songwriters Guild in the current model because it's just not as relevant as it used to be. One of the things that you see in here immediately, it used to be, and we're going to talk about this a little more as we go, but publishers, when we printed CDs, when we printed vinyl, when we made cassettes, the minute it was printed, the writers got paid. No matter how many sold. So if a publisher said, hey, we're going to print 500,000 copies, there was a specific rate applied to what each copy would be worth in terms of how much the writer would get paid. The writer would get paid it no matter what. If they sold one copy, writer gets paid. The whole lot, as if they sold all 500,000. Because that doesn't exist anymore, right? Because now it's all digital. Without that print option, it really shifts and changes the need for the guild as much, because the guild used to be the group that would uphold that particular right for the writer. But again, because it's digital and no one's going, well, we expected to sell this many in digital and therefore we're going to pay for you in advance, everybody waits to the back end now for payment. So you used to literally, like, that's why all those 90s artists, those 80s artists, I mean, everybody that was around during the era of after vinyl, because vinyl wasn't really as great. Once it got to cassette, and especially once it transitioned to CD, Boyz II Men, those guys were loaded. I mean, the problem that they ran into, like a lot of artists do, is anytime they spend a lot of money on an album that doesn't do well, a lot of artists, it happens sort of at the end, they owe that money back. And a lot of artists tend to do this on their way, like, first album costs this much, next album costs this much, the next one's this much and this much. And we're talking not just the production of the album, but we're talking the marketing. We're going to market it this much, this much, this much. And eventually they get to a spot where, like, their sales are doing this on the opposite side of that. And that makeup difference gets pulled from anything they sold in the past. So, like, anything they sold in the past that they did well in the past, but they didn't do great in the future, it just goes back and retroactively pulls from that amount of money. But those guys are making a lot of money. When they went to CD for the first time, they were one of the largest major artists to go exclusively to CD during that CD transition, and no more to cassette. They were being paid for each unit up front. You know what I mean? So they got paid. They didn't have to necessarily wait that whole period to find out how much they sold. The book kind of talked about this. Hopefully you're kind of keeping up with it. If you hadn't, I know a lot of you kind of jumped in a little later in midstream for the class. On Canvas in the assignment list, there's a chapter by chapter outline. I don't know if you guys have seen that, where it kind of talks about like which chapters you're supposed to be on. This right now is chapter 4. So like there's a little more detail in the book that kind of talks about that. But I always like to talk. For me, I always like, we only have so much time, so I always like kind of talked about the stuff that's like super, super crucial. I want to go to copyrights. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question about the Canvas app.
Huh? Yeah.
How do I get it to show our class on it? It doesn't look at all.
Did you do the join code? Or did you use the link that I sent you?
Yeah.
Via email?
Yeah.
And when it jumped in, it has like a join code at the very end of that extension. I actually just saw somebody's. Did you get in? You didn't get into it at all, the Canvas class yet? Raise your hand if you're in and it's successful so far. Okay. I think it just, let me see. Thank you guys. Let me just see here in the. Sorry, you can use the enroll code, but the enroll code is literally the same extension that's at the back end of that address. Just trying to remember, I had it here somewhere. Someone I just had sent it to. Actually, remind me before you leave, okay? And I'll just make sure that we get there. Oh, there it is, actually. Here, you want to write this down? It's capital D, capital K, 9, capital T, capital C, and capital L. That's the enroll code. So, like, if you punch that in, actually, that part I don't remember where the. Is there an enroll or add class option on the left? And it should just let you punch in and add to that class.
Well, let me just see. You work on that. Let me know how that goes while we're jamming through some of this. Okay. This is huge. These are very important. This is like, it's the simplest thing. This is like 4 lines. But this is like huge. This is the money element of what we're going to talk about. So like, I guess like any other entity, business entity, they kind of tended to, like in the 80s and 90s, develop this weird lingo that uses these terms that don't necessarily coincide with like exactly what they mean. And in the 90s, recording contracts were notorious for using terms that sounded either positive or negative, but actually were the opposite, because like the goal was to mislead the signers. So like they would say things like, they would say like something to the effect of like, 100% of the mechanical royalties would go to the artist minus the shared percentage that belongs to the record label. Where the front end of the statement sounds very good and positive, but if you didn't read on and focus on what the last half of it said, you might have missed the fact that 100% of the royalties don't actually go, mechanical royalties don't actually go to the artists, right? Sometimes in the contracts that you'll see, they'll say something to the effect of, less expense receipts, right? Or less, I guess expense receipts is still the term that they use in that contract, but the expense receipts could have included all the cost of production for the recording, which means those expense receipts, which sound like they could be small, because you think receipt, how much could a receipt be, right? But expense receipts as a total combined, it could be several $100,000 that are taken out or away from the royalties. And so, like, the question I always ask on a contract, like, royalties is a term you need to be familiar with. A royalty essentially is something that's owed and due the artist. But one of the really bad parts is in the 90s, they used the word royalty with the term advance. And once they combined those two, it made the royalty something that's not due the artist, technically. It's something that is given as a favor to the artist, and then it's collected based upon the real royalties that come through in mechanical or performance, which means if like the real royalties didn't make up the value of an advance royalty, so let's say an advance royalty for you was $100,000, but you only made $10,000 combined mechanical performance, then at the end of the day, you end up owing the difference back. Does that make sense? So, eventually you end up owing the record label $90,000. So, it's one of those things where it's like, they do a little bit of misleading. So the hard part about this that you just need to really remember is the mechanical, it's royalties paid by the record label or publisher to the owner of the copyright, okay? But it's specifically, and this is really interesting, so like the mechanical royalties paid by the record label or publisher to the owner of the copyright. But specifically to the owner of the copyright. So when I sign a publishing deal, going back to publishing, if you weren't here that day, there's a lot of takeaways from it, but one of the big ones is when you sign a publishing deal, you sign away the copyright. That's just part of the deal. That's how the deal is written. You could sign away at 50. If you're doing it at 50-50, co-publish, and you say, me, myself, as a publisher, and then I'm signing with a large entity, then you get to retain 50% of it. If you don't do that, then 100% of the copyright ownership is owned by a publisher. So that means the mechanical royalty could be a royalty paid by the record label or the publisher to the publisher, right? And then, how do we know how much comes down to the artist or the writer or whoever you are? Geez, you know what? Let's just say you're the hype man. You don't even do anything. You just stand on the stage and go, yeah, hey, yeah, right? And you showcase whatever. But like they wrote you into the deal. They could have wrote you into the deal any way they wanted to. They could have said, hey, our hype man gets 10%, okay? So that 10% had to be negotiated with whoever owns the copyright. So they take all the money from this block, and then they say, oh yeah, hype man gets 10%. So that's part of his deal. That's the deal we made. We're going to honor that. We're going to give you your 10%, right? Sounds pretty reasonable. Sounds like they're doing a good thing, right? But in reality, they are the first stop for who gets the money. Does that make sense? So like that's part of why it takes so long to get paid. And it's like, you guys ever had a job where they like overpaid you? What did they do? I've seen a lot of companies do this, and it's like, it's funny to watch what their response is. One company I've seen that I worked for, if they overpaid you, they just didn't pay you whatever they overpaid you the next paycheck.
I saw another company that if they overpaid you, they expected you literally to bring in cash whatever they accidentally overpaid you back to the office. And it's like, okay, but I'm going to get paid in 2 weeks. Yeah, but to them, they needed that money right now because they overpaid you. So, like, it depends on how they handle that. For a record label, they don't ever overpay you. They will never overpay you. Why? Because they just make sure that the process for paying you is so slow and it's looked upon so heavily that no one ever accidentally gets more money than they're supposed to. They would prefer you to accidentally get less money than you're supposed to. Right? That's the preference from a record label standpoint. So they'll drag their feet on a couple things, right? And they'll just make sure. So sometimes, like, it's really funny how this works out. When you get, let's say, when you get a bunch of spins on radio, the PRO not only takes the roster, the actual information they're given, they then audit it. So, like, sometimes what they'll do is they'll split the money and they'll pay you a certain percentage of it now. And then they'll say, we're going to hold the rest until the audit comes back to 100% prove that we do owe you that correct amount, and then they'll pay out the rest. But either way, mechanical is a royalty paid to the copyright owner, okay? The performance, and this is a mechanical royalty, performance royalty. The performance royalty is paid by radio and TV through the PRO. So we haven't necessarily established who the PRO is, but the PRO essentially it's the performing rights organization. It's a third-party company. Been around for many years. A third-party company collects what we call performance royalties. But here's the kick, okay? A performance royalty is specifically of a copywritten recording. And that's where it kind of takes a weird shift. It's not a copywritten song. It's a copywritten recording. Follow that? So a performance royalty isn't when you go perform. Performance royalty is when someone pushes play. In your notes, I would just jot that down. When someone pushes play, they owe you a performance royalty. When a sale is made, they owe you a mechanical royalty. That makes it real simple because a lot of the jargon sounds so close. Now you actually do earn royalties for performing, and then you also earn, in addition to those royalties, if you were to perform live, you also obviously receive compensation for your performance. But performing live used to not hold a royalty. Like when I was in a band in like 2012, I think, I got an email from my PRO, and they said, "Hey, great news! We're finally now going to pay royalties for live performance." And they did not do that before. So like before, how did I get paid for a live performance? Whoever hired me paid me, right? Now you get that pay plus the PRO will actually pay you if you do a live performance in a real venue of your own music. So you actually get an extra, I always tell people it's like $30. Last time I think I got 35. I played 10 songs of my own, $35. It's not a lot. But hey, pays for dinner, kind of, or drinks. Yeah.
Does an artist make money off a cover? Like when they cover a song?
Oh, so the artist actually. What's interesting about that is when an artist covers a song, payments are made. Like the way that it's split out. Like payments are made to those who wrote it, to those, of course, and it's done through who owns the copyright. But then and that's what we're about to talk about. The copyright ownership has two phases. Whoever did the performance of it, right? And so like if it was a cover, it's whoever newly performed it and whoever did the original creation of it. So that's the second realm of it. So yeah, when you do a cover, you can make money. It's just that you make substantially less money.
Yeah, because you're like lower on the totem pole.
Yeah, you're way down there. And you may have even had to pay a lot of money. Like, it depends on who that cover was from. Like, some covers, you can't go to the Harry Fox agency and, like, if you're, like, a larger, like, hey, I'm Beyonce, and I'm going to do a cover of a Coldplay song, right? You don't go to the Harry Fox agency. And if you're a real artist who's going to have a real release of a cover, you have to go through the record label. And they'll direct you through the publishing company. In a roundabout way, they're going to send you in a lot of different directions, but that's going to be like a real deal. Like, it's not going to look like, I have to pay a $50 fee and that's it. that's what they do with the Harry Fox agency, realizing that like if you just wanted to record it for YouTube, but it wasn't ever going to go anywhere, we'll take your $50 because we're never going to need any more from you because you won't ever make any more from it. But yeah, they do make a good amount of money off it. Most of them, surprisingly, don't really make a lot of money off of covers, but it's all about the publicity. It's like all about like getting yourself out there. So like Pentatonics, those guys are, they make more money on their public performances, but their whole record deal is really just an outlining of how popular they are. They could have received a record deal for playing kazoo. You know what I mean? Like if they had the same amount of YouTube hits, right? The same amount of YouTube hits would have got on the same record deal doing something completely different because of their overall visibility. And they, of course, will probably make more money playing kazoo, writing original songs than they do doing covers. But, that's how life goes. So, but it's huge to understand these two things. So, like, if there's anything you walk away from tonight, mechanical royalties, right? This is when money changes hands or something's sold. Performance is when someone pushes play. And that's the beauty of the performance royalty is like all that stuff you hear from the old, like I don't know if you guys even remember the oldies. I don't know if oldie stations still exist because I don't listen to the radio. But like when I was a kid and I was driving in my dad's truck, we'd be listening to like stuff that was old. You know what I mean? Like stuff that was like 60s and 70s, right? But those guys are still getting performance royalties from just someone pushing play. I mentioned a couple weeks that there was an article that I had read about Sting making something like $5,000 a day just from the one song, SOS. He doesn't do anything. He just gets paid this because people keep playing it, right? It's just, in his sleep, he's making tons of money. But it was that original recording. Okay. We're going to skip some of this because... Okay, we need to talk about copyright protection. So, a copyright, just to be kind of like really quick with like understanding a copyright. The copyright is harbored by the Library of Congress. So the Library of Congress is a physical place. You can go to it in D.C. I used to live near D.C., so like the first time I ever filed a copyright, I remember this. I filed my copyright, and I was like, it's been a month. I'm like, where's my copyright? Right? I filed my copyright. I don't know where it is. It's been a month. And maybe 2 months later, I literally drove to the Library of Congress, and I went to their main office for the copyright office. Waited in this huge line. Go up to the front. I'm like, hey, I want to see if I can pick up my copyright. I submitted it 2 months ago. And they're like, yeah, it takes about 6 months to process, and you'll receive it in the mail. You can pick it up, but it's easier to just wait till it's received in the mail. It'll take 6 months to process, and it'll take 1 week to ship. So, and I lived like an hour and a half away, so I was like, okay, I'll wait. I had no idea how it worked. I just went up there, and I was just like, I was literally like 16, you know what I mean? Like, I just had my license. I'm like, I'm going to go check this out. It was really funny. It was just this funny experience. Like now as I look at it looking back, I'm like, wow, I was really not knowledgeable about how it works. The Library of Congress harbors a couple of things. Trademarks, right? They harbor trademarks and they harbor copyrights. And there's a huge difference between the two. So like a big thing that like artists typically have to understand is that like, okay, if I want to protect my artist's name, there's times when that falls under copyright, and most of the time it falls under trademark. Because I can not only just trademark my name, but I can trademark what my name looks like. And that's what a lot of artists like to lock in early. We use a nice font, and we use that for the next 20 years, and that actually gets trademarked just as it is, so no one else can use that kind of mock-up, right? ABBA is one that I could easily think of, because of the way that it lays out.
Why does it take 6 months for it to process?
The copyright process takes 6 months because they have to clear that you originally wrote it. Like what they have to do is they have to send it through this tedious process where they essentially take the entire catalog of music that they have and they have to match it up and make sure that you fall outside of a certain amount of copyright infringement kind of limitations. So like their goal is to just make sure that if they issue you a copyright that they can legitimately say it is an original work, right? That you didn't borrow or use anything else from anybody else. Does that make sense? It doesn't necessarily guarantee that, but it typically like outlines it in a good way where it's a safe margin. What was new over the last 5 years is if you have to actually own, this is really interesting. I'm sorry, you don't have to own, but if you own a copyright, that copyright not only gets registered at the Copyright Office, but it also gets registered with video services like YouTube. So like when I file a copyright, it actually gets filed through YouTube, which means if anybody takes my music that's not me, that doesn't have my user profile, right, that doesn't have my legitimate user profile that's synced with my copyright information, you couldn't repost my work because it's protected by copyright. Does that make sense? Which is why, like, that's what protects like an artist from like, and this happens all the time. Like an artist wants to release a music video. A lot of times there's always a debate. Does a record label release the music video, or does the artist release the music video? Why would it matter?
It's copyrighted.
One, it's copywritten, but why would it matter who gets to release it? Let's think YouTube. Why would it matter who gets to release it?
Because whose name is on the ownership of the copyright, that determines on who is it.
Yeah, but why does it matter? Because it matters because if I'm going to get 2 million views, whoever owns it, whoever hosts it, posts it, receives monetary value for it. Does that make sense? And that's always like a huge debate. So like that's why it's easy. It's nice to have the copyright to kind of that. Like since they started doing that with YouTube, I'm like, oh, this is really cool for artists because it keeps them from having to deal with it. Because I've seen where like not a publishing house, like a video production service will say, no, we get to release the video because we made it. Where it's like, well, the artist paid for it, so the artist owns it, right? Or the record label pays for it, so the record label owns it. And that ownership, which is covered by copyright law, falls to whoever holds the copyright. So that's kind of the cool part of the process. But that's why it takes 6 months, because they have to go through this huge process. Plus, there's a huge backlog. You can pay to expedite your copyrights. I think it costs like $1,200
To make it go fast.
to make it go real fast. You could have it like in 2 weeks. Yeah.
They're playing games.
Or yeah.
So it doesn't take 6 months.
It does. It takes 6 months for everybody else who's not a major artist. A record label, a lot of times, will pay for the expedition. So they'll, if you're on a label, they'll pay for the expedition. They'll push it through, get it done fast. As a film writer, this is a really interesting thing. You can actually, as a film writer, you could do something called pre-copywriting, or essentially it's a pre-authorized copyright, where you copyright the work as you're writing it, and that is another massive fee. But the benefit to it is like, let's say you're like, oh, I have this idea for this movie, so I wrote a really rough script. It protects it from the moment that it's being built, so that if like you were to take that script and some huge Hollywood producer came in and finalized it, there would be some running kind of information about how that script's looking in its process as to who's owning it before it gets out of hand. Because a lot of times what was happening is you'd write a script, take it to a film house, and someone would just literally just steal it. They would just literally just take it, like line for line. We're just going to take it. You know what I mean? Because there was no logging of like how the beginning of the phase of it, what it looked like, how it transitioned, and then it became like a he said, she said kind of thing in court, and no one could really track. Oh, hold on, we lost. Don't know. Hang with me. Sorry, it's not coming back. Anyway, so in the copyright process, there is a bundle of rights. I want you to write these 6 down because these are going to be huge, but obviously we have to wait till the projector comes back. Sorry about that. We're almost there. So like the really cool part about the copyrights is that copyrights only cost, I think right now they lowered their fee. I think they're technically back down to $35. They used to be $45. So you could pay $35, wait 6 months. You could pay the expedition fee, which is just an outrageous amount, and it can happen like very quickly. For most artists, like for me as an example, like when do I do my copyrights? I can wait to bundle my copyrights as a grouping, as a portfolio. But what I like to do is I like write a song, write another song, in that quarter of writing songs, copyright. But the cool part about that is that I may not necessarily have to go record those songs immediately. You know what I mean? Like those songs may be used later down the road. They're not necessarily going to be used tomorrow. But their copyright process is already in process immediately. So like even if I'm not going to use something, I throw it in the copyright grouping so that it's done. Sorry, I don't know what it's doing now. What time is it? It's many of the time?
7 o'clock.
Wow. Bummer.
It's at 85%.
Can you add stuff to a song that you copyrighted?
Yes. And all you have to do is submit the revision.
How long does that take?
I mean, technically it's covered. Like the copyright rule, here's a real kicker for you. The copyright rule, according to the Library of Congress, is that as soon as you make it, you own it. The problem is that you can't really prove that to a court of law without a couple of things. So like I always tell writers, creators, you know, obviously file a copyright the way you should, but also record everything. You know what I mean? Like when I write, I record it. When I'm writing with others, I record it. Like I record like the process, record everything. Then you have something to back you up because it may take you a week to do the filing. Who knows what could happen in that amount of time. But the important part is, and this is what's really weird, like I got hired on a job to come in as a writer. They asked me to come in as a writer. They paid me as a guitar player, so they didn't pay me as a writer, which means it didn't fall under a work for hire status, which is good. But then when I went around and asked them, did they file the copyrights like 6 months later? My assumption was that what they were going to do is, because I did a co-writing. It was a co-write. And it was with a bigger company that they would have had someone do the admin for it. And they were like, oh no, the artist lost his deal, so we just didn't do anything. So I was like, wait, so like you're telling me that this authentic work that I co-wrote with somebody else is literally sitting in an uncopywritten status? You know what I'm saying? So like I quickly moved to just what I did, because you could do two things. You can either go copyright it with whoever you co-wrote it with, or you could just separate the parts that you wrote, finish the song, which is what I did, and then copyright that version. So there's a couple of rules about that. There is not necessarily a length of time. As soon as the office receives it, they put it in with the file. And what usually happens is they just wait until, like, it's interesting. Your copyright fee is like $35, but if you go to court, it all of a sudden becomes expensive. And then you're going to pay like, I think it's like a $750 fee to have them open your case. Just open your case. Say, hey, can you look at the file? Right? Does that make sense? Not really. But. So like they're kind of, it's interesting. So like they're harboring all this information in the event that you might need to use it for legality or reasons or whatever. But like, so, you know, you can add modifications. The thing that they also do is they do something called the best. These are the bundles I want you to write down so I can talk while you guys are jotting these down. You need to understand these 6 and I'll explain them. They're not too difficult. But they also do something called the best version. So that means you like actually can continually send like Christmas cards. You can send the Copyright Office every year the best version of your song. Like if you recorded it 5 different times, and I did this as an artist. Like first time I recorded a song, wrote it, recorded it, I sent it to the Copyright Office. And then when I made it into like my first EP, sent it to the Copyright Office. When it became a song on the album, sent it to the Copyright Office. When that album went really well and we decided we're going to hire a larger producer to produce that song, that version went back to the Copyright Office. So like each new version can just be updated to the Copyright Office and they'll just continually keep the file and keep updating it. But it changes once, like if myself as my own writer, I make modifications to it, change it or whatever, submit it, they'll just keep accepting it and updating it. But if somebody else does that, it falls outside of this. And then it becomes a different kind of deal. And this is when it gets weird. Like if I said, and I'll be right there in 1 second. Like let's just say I'm like, all the way to the end of this phase, I've been copywriting it myself, and a producer comes in, changes 1 word of my song. All of a sudden, we both have to end up on that copyright, and now it has to be filed together, which sucks. But yeah, question.
Okay, so I was just wondering, question kind of just popped into my mind. My dad, when I was younger, he used to do a lot of recording, and he said that was back before like the internet was really popular, and this was really easy to access like it is nowadays. But he said he would take a copy of his recorded stuff and then also the written sheet music and then mail it to himself, and then he could prove it. Is that a true thing?
That is okay. So it is a true thing. That's the poor man's copyright, which is a little different now because you can just email it to yourself and it gets a timestamp. But a poor man's copyright is exactly what you're explaining. I have poor man's copywritten material in my bundle of stuff. I used to do it all the time before the age of the internet and instantaneous. Now, because before you used to have to mail your stuff to
If I had music, I had to mail that whole package to the copyright office. So what I would do is I'd make 2 packages. One gets sent to the copyright office, and one I would actually just send to my dad because, I just say, hey, Dad, you got a package coming your way. It says do not open, so of course, do not open it because if you open it, then it can't be, it's not legit. Yeah, you used to do it all the time. Now, the court of law eventually stopped honoring it because they eventually got to a point where they were like, why can't you just spend, $30, $40 and just copyright it for real? You know what I mean? Like, they got to a point where they kind of got tired of, because if you were sued for something and you only had the poor man's copyright, you just had this little package and it was you validating it. Here's my little package that I never opened from whenever, right? The post office can't go, oh yeah, we remember that package, right? They can't really, even though it's stamped and it's marked and it's got the date, they can't necessarily vouch for it because no one really remembers it. Where the Library of Congress can literally go, oh, here was the day that it was filed and here's the material that we received. That makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
And so, like, not having that third party, somebody to back you up on it, became frustrating for the court of law. So a lot of times, the court of law just looks at that and goes, "Yeah, this isn't a real deal. Like, if you were a real artist and a real writer, and you had like a real something, you would have really filed it." And that changed. It changed over time because that used to be like everybody did that. Like, you know what I mean? That was one of the first things I learned when I learned about copyright. Hey guys, first thing you're gonna do, go do this, right? And immediately go send this to yourself. But I still do it. I still email myself stuff all the time just so that I have some sort of stuff, timestamp, date. This is the first time it was created. This is me doing it, right?
Yeah.
I had one writing session where I had another writer in the room, and he wasn't doing anything. They hired him to come do this deal with me, and it just wasn't doing anything. So I just recorded that whole session, packaged that thing up, and the recording of the session was what I sent in as my copyright, like to the copyright office. Because you can hear him hanging out, going, oh, "This is my idea," but he was like not actively participating in the writing process. It was just, you know what I mean? He was just off in his own little world. And my fear is there were only a handful of people in the room at the given time, was that he was going to say, oh yeah, well I co-wrote that song, right? Even though he was just in the room not making any contributions whatsoever. So I literally just sent that recording in, just to cover my bait. So, there's a lot of ways you could do that. But yeah, that was definitely a thing. It definitely was. I mean, and you could still use that. Like, they call it the poor man's copyright because like people used to do that in lieu of paying the fee.
Yeah.
The fee hasn't really increased much, but the funny part is because it hasn't increased much, it also still at one point in time it was $45 to file the copyright, like in the 90s, which was a lot more money than it is now. The other thing about copywritten works, so like it's not listed here. Actually, we're going to get into it in a second. I'll just say this: in copywritten works, there's a couple ways to do it. You can copyright a work under a portfolio clause, which means you could take a whole album, copyright it as an entire album at once. You could take a whole movie, copyright it as an entire movie all at once. You could do all those kinds of things as a one big chunk. But because the Copyright Office only has so much information they can store, they don't necessarily go in and itemize every, like if you did, I remember I did this once. One copyright portfolio I put in, literally had like 100 songs on it. And you can do that, but they will not itemize all of those works, which means that when you have to go hunt for the like actual location of when you copyright something inside of a portfolio, you have to have good records of which portfolio. And I have like logs of, okay, like if I wanted to go search for copyright for this song, it falls under this particular portfolio. I'll find the item and the information number under it, but I won't be able to just directly type that title in and get the search response and have it fall back in the search listings where I can say, oh, this was the date that I copyrighted. So that's kind of an interesting part there. But the exclusive rights, this is what you own. This is huge. This is what you own when you own the copyright. This is what you own. Reproduce copywritten work, which means copies, okay? CDs, digitally, that means selling the digital, essentially. Derivatives, you can make your own derivatives. If you wrote your own song and you decided you wanted to flip-flop it and rearrange it, or you wanted to make your own version of a Weird Al song of your own song, you have the right to do it because you are the copyright owner. Does that make sense? This also is very, very interesting because, like, when you're talking about covers, going back to this, a lot of artists are encouraged to do covers if their publishing company happens to be the same publishing company as the person who they're going to cover. Right? Because that just brings more money to the overall pot, and they're inside of that same world. The distribution of copies, So the distribution, actually, this part would be streaming services, digital downloads, all that kind of stuff. So the distribution itself. I'm sorry, where this one is to re-record and re-record and re-record. Right. So like if I'm the Beatles, I can do like a million versions of my own songs as long as I own them. But as soon as I don't own my own publishing, that's what gets weird for certain artists. Like certain artists who've been with certain publishing companies and they want to re-record their own music, they don't own their own copyright, so they have to go to the publisher and go, hey, we would like to re-record our own music. And they have to have the approval. Not only do they have to have the approval before they do it, they have to have the approval after it's done. So the publisher's going to go listen to it and go, do we like the version that you did? Will we like releasing it? Are we not really interested in that? You know what I mean? So like they actually like look at that really closely. To perform the work publicly, to display the work publicly. These are two different things. So me performing it and the display of the work typically just falls under the ability for me to have some sort of representation of the work. When I copyright an album, I copyright the artwork with it. That is the element that falls under number 5. Now you can copyright art. So like for art, that's a huge thing right there. But when it comes down to my music, like the photo of me on my single, when I copyright that single itself, I own the rights to that work. Which is why you pay the artist that makes your cover. You pay the photographer that shoots the photos for your cover, right? You don't get that done for free because otherwise, if you did, they would own the copyright for that element, which gets really weird. You don't want to share copyrights for an album just because someone took a photo. Not worth it. And then this performance happens to be transmission. So to perform copywritten work by means of transmission, this is radio. This is push play, radio, streaming. This is radio, this would be streaming or satellite radio. Okay, so all those things fall under your exclusive rights, which means that you can't separate these rights, but you can license these rights. So like, I don't know if you guys know much about licensing, but licensing essentially is you're literally going, it's like you're selling something of your work as a separate piece for a specific amount of time. So like you can license certain things away within a certain means. We're going to talk about licensing, but you can license these away. You just don't necessarily want to give these away until you're ready. I had an artist, I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but oh no, I'm sorry. It's this artist I was just telling you about. The artist the student that had gotten a contract in the mail. And the first question I had to ask him was, are they asking for your copyrights? You know what I mean? Because it means everything. Now, if you're not attached to your music, or not super in love with it, I guess it doesn't mean as much to you. But that's your money. Now, the fair use of the copywritten material. There are 2 terms that you do need to be familiar with. I don't know if the second one's in here. Did I leave it in here? Oh, maybe I didn't. No, I didn't. Yeah, I don't know why it's not in here. Okay. Sorry. There are 2 terms in copywriting, and you need to understand them. There's fair use and there's first use. First use is not in the slides, so I would like to explain first use first. In your notes, write first use. The copyright owner has the exclusive right to the first use of their work. What that means,
Can you say it one more time?
the copyright owner has the exclusive right to the first use of their work. That's called the first use clause, essentially, or rule. The copyright owner has the exclusive right to the first use of their work. What that means is I can't be an artist that has a brand new work that's about to hit the shelves tomorrow. That great example. You ever heard an artist that's like, you're watching them at a show, and they're like, hey, I want to play a brand new song for you. It's coming out tomorrow. That means that you can't record it and then go home and do a cover of it and release it the day before they're supposed to release it. Does that make sense? So cover songs are not allowed to be done before the actual release because of the right for first use. there's a huge reason for that, and that's because, of course, if let's say I wrote a song and you covered it and released it first, I mean, if the song was good enough, it could gain you the popularity that should have been due me as the artist, right? Does that make sense? And that's kind of the rule. That's why, I mean, you can, essentially, you would just be taken to court for the value of whatever the damage was that they would call it. But that's different than fair use, but it's often confused. In fair use, so this one's fair use on screen. Fair use basically says that you are not required, okay, you are not required to receive consent from the copyright owner if you fall under these criteria, to do these following. So we're going to talk about these just in a moment. It won't take long. So like great examples are like, because most of the time you need the copyright owner's permission to do a lot of things. In print music, if you wanted to make a copy of a print music piece, a piece of music that was on print, they actually don't give you that right. They'll just say, no, you have to order, you have to buy however many pieces of music you need. So like, I'm sorry, do you play in an ensemble or do you just play?
Oh yeah.
You do, right?
Yeah.
Which one do you play in?
I'm in piano ensemble, I'm in percussion ensemble, I'm in chamber choir.
Okay, let's talk about percussion ensemble. That's a good one. So like in reality, in order to be inside of the copyright rules, every member of the ensemble has to have their own music, and their own music has to be legitimately purchased. A lot of schools, I don't know, did they give you some sort of technology fee or some sort of? Some people do like a music fee.
They had, oh yeah, music special fee.
Yeah, that the fee pays essentially the fee pays for your.
Exactly. For example, for my private lessons that I have every week, that's a $500 music special fee.
Jeez, wow. Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
It's worth it.
Yeah. Okay, and that pays for all that, essentially all that stuff. Otherwise, outside of that, you're not allowed to do certain things with copyrighted material unless you fall under one of these categories. Okay. And that's where this kind of ends up being a thing. So in this law, the purpose of the character of the use of the work is clause 1, and then the nature of the copywritten work itself. So like, what's the purpose? A lot of educational groups, like nonprofit educational groups, most often just cite it's for educational purposes. It doesn't work for all educational facilities because usually the colleges are blocked outside of this provision. So like a lot of colleges do not allow for certain things to be used because of educational purposes. And very specifically those who make a profit, so like for-profit colleges. But a lot of times they cite this because like if you guys are coming in here and you pay to be in this class, and I, in this class, use copywritten material that I haven't either licensed or purchased, then I'm breaking the law because technically we fall outside of that ruling. That's why you're supposed to buy your own book. Now, I don't know whether or not you do or not, or you just find a PDF BitTorrent or whatever they're doing these days, right? But like that's why when you're in a class, you're responsible for buying your own book, because I can't just go make photocopies of stuff because it's a copywritten published thing, right? And we fall outside of the guidelines of this. And then the amount of substantial portion used. Now, I am allowed to take certain small portions of copywritten material, mash them together, and use them in certain ways. So, like, if I'm not using full pages of content, based upon that copyright rule, it allows for some freedom. And then the effect of the use in the potential market. That's the biggest thing. The court of law typically just looks at this and goes, did you hurt the bottom line of whoever the copyright owner was by doing what you did, right? And that's how we got, that's how Napster got sued when their whole thing came through, because in reality they did have a huge effect on the ability for people to make money in the big picture. I'm going to jam through this. Okay. Copyright ownership with multiple authors. Copyright ownership only asks you, it's really interesting, when you file the forms, it only asks you what the people did in a very general form. So like if I was a musician and I wrote all the guitar parts to a song, which chords aren't necessarily copyrightable, but the stuff that happens with the chords as they transition, a lot of the other fluid stuff that goes with it is copyrightable when it's attached to a melody. If I wrote the chords, I don't write, I wrote the chords. I'll literally, in the copyright form, I just put wrote music, right? It doesn't even ask for like, well, what chords did you use, or how long were the phrases. It doesn't ask you any details. You don't even take out like a sheet of music and go, well, I did this part and highlighted in red, and this other guy did this part and highlighted in green. You don't even do that in copyright filing. You literally just go, I did this and he did that, very vaguely. And then in most cases, they literally just split off in equal shares. They could, like in this one, you know, they could split off in unequal shares, but the copyright ownership doesn't actually, like, if we shared a copyright, if I said you own 40% of it and I own 60% of it, like, that doesn't mean anything in the copyright ownership. What we end up doing that is more legitimate is we literally make a contract as to how we use our music, with the understanding that you receive 40 and I receive 60 or whatever. The easiest way to fix that or do that is if we just become publishers, right? Or make our own publishing entity, and in our own publishing contract, that publishing contract details the value of what your work was and the value of what my work was, to kind of simplify it. Doing it in a copyright is not very easy, and it doesn't really, people don't look at it. Like, no one literally looks at it and goes, oh, what do the copyright forms say? That's not typically something that's done. Typically, instead, what they do is that is an internal agreement. So every band, every group that's a band or an artist that has multiple artists, actually have an internal artist agreement that outline the money that they make just between themselves. Without it, they don't have any sort of deal or commitment to each other as to how they were splitting the money. If they did not have that, some of them, like, instead of doing it internally, when they sign to the record label as part of the elements of their contract, it'll detail your share and your share and your share and your share specifically in the contract. Problem with that is that's a blanketed number, which means if anything ever changed, you can't just go back into that contract and make an adjustment to it, which is why I like internal agreements. And even on the copyright ownership, I prefer internal agreements because let's say we copyright the song and we did it 50-50. But we took it into the studio and we're ready to release it, and as often happens, you know, the producer looked at it and was like, you know, we should loop the bridge a few extra bars and cut the whole ending of the song and just transition it out this way. I mean, a producer literally could just go, yeah, let's do this. The engineer's going to do it for, you know, an hour maybe at most, and then before you know it, it's done. And all of a sudden it changes like what happened here. Right? But this gets filed almost immediately, early on in the stage. So I always tell people, hey, look, don't make too much of a huff about what percentages are until you have an album that's ready to be released. If you're still in the studio, you have no idea. You just don't. For the value of the song and the sake of the song, looping the chorus one more time and dumping a part that you wrote might be what it takes to make that thing sell. So, you know, okay, let's see. This kind of just talks about the overall copyright ownership limitations. Yeah, the one weird part about copyright ownership is copyright ownership is only, it focuses on the bundled rights. It's not like something that you like own, but you own, and the value of it only comes through when you make money. So like that's what I always tell people when they, especially cover songs. It's like, hey, you don't have to worry about the legals until you make money. Once you make money, everybody's all over who owes what, who has what, where the money goes. You make $0, you know what I mean? It's not like you're sitting in bed holding your copyright. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't work like that. So like that copyright's kind of like it's kind of an intangible object. And we talked about the contributions. You can transfer copyrights, and a lot of artists have to, because if I'm writing a song, I file a copyright with the Library of Congress, I own the copyright, but all of a sudden a record company comes in, wants to make a record deal, they also want to make a publishing deal, immediately I have to transfer my rights to them. It's just how it works. So transferring is a process. There is a fee for transferring. This is where it gets dodgy. I would write this down. Some of you have heard of this. Not everybody has. This is this is actually one of the things that some of what you just saw is also on the exam for the midterm. But this is one of those things that's on the exam that's kind of not necessarily a
trick question, but it's a very focused question. Works made for hire. Works made for hire are anything that you were paid to do inside of the outlined job description. So we talked about this last week or the week before, and I mentioned, hey, you know, if it's a work made for hire, it should have been outlined in some sort of job description or deal memo specifically to you. So like you can't just show up and get paid for something and be like, oh, I didn't realize I was being paid to do this as a work for hire. Like it should have been outlined and explained to you. So like again, it's not supposed to be a surprise. So you should see some sort of like deal or something come through in order to make some sense of that. Hopefully that helps. In order to be a work for hire, and there's some stipulations about being a work for hire. A work made for hire is best used, a work made for hire, and it's consistently used throughout the music scheme. Work made for hire is best used when you just need someone to jump in the studio and fill in on an instrument that you don't necessarily plan to be part of the band. This song just needs that. It's funny because I've been a Muse fan for years, and there's this one album where they randomly have a bass clarinet on their album, and it's just like, wow, this is the most random thing. They don't tour around with that guy. He's not part of the band. That's a work for hire. You just pay him, come in, do this one part, you're out. You don't receive royalties on it. So this is a key, although I don't think it says it here, does it? Work made for hire, these guys do not receive royalties. They can if you're gracious, but they do not receive royalties, and that's the big change. I mean, it's not a change, but that's the big shift. That's like why this is such a big deal. So, you know, Brandon, if I paid you $10 to come play piano on my song, on my album, you'd have to know, and I'd have to explain this to you because it would be very deceptive of me not to, which I think is very important, either via email or in some sort of written contract. One of you, was it you that said that you'd performed on somebody else's album? Yes. Did you end up, I forget if you probably already answered this question. Did you file some sort of contract or some sort of deal memo? Did you get paid?
Yes.
Okay. Did you ever get paid after that?
I got paid for the hour I recorded, for the 2 hours I did, so I got paid for that. I didn't, not after.
Not after. Okay. So clearly, this is you. Okay? You have no so you have no ownership over copyright material. What happens is the employer, right, is the owner of the copyright. Whoever hired you is the owner of the copyright. And they essentially pay you, and once they pay you, that is your compensation for the life cycle of whatever you just did, which is good and bad, depending on how much you got paid. So, and I know a lot of musicians that do this. I mean, I hired several string musicians for one of my albums, and I literally paid them $100. But that's because at the time I only had $100, and they understood that it was a work for hire. They also understood this could probably go nowhere. So when it got published and it went like to national markets, you know, and stuff was on the radio, then all of a sudden they were like, wow, this actually did something. And so what I ended up doing is I ended up sending an additional check after it hit radio and after we started receiving money, and I gave them extra money because I was like, I didn't know, I could have just said, hey, it's fine, you were work for hire, it was very clear, but you know, I mean, you guys are on the radio, so I mean, like with me, so I mean, you were part of the process, so I like firmly believe you should receive additional compensation. Some people, what they'll do is they'll build like a work for hire with some sort of tiered benchmarks that for like almost like a bonus for the work for hire groups, which would say, look, you're work for hire, but if we sold 10,000 copies, you're going to get an extra compensation fee paid to you. Because obviously, you know, it just sucks if you did work for hire. Like if I was the guy that, I came in, I was a work for hire, and they hired me to go ba-da-ba-ba-ba, right? And I have to hear that every day of my life, right? Over and over and over on TV, but I got hired for that gig for $100. You know what I mean? I kind of be like a little, you know, frustrated with that particular situation. But I mean, that's how it works. They literally will pay, like,
as a work for hire, you're being paid and compensated up front. You could technically, an artist could technically be a work for hire, right? They don't want to be, so a lot of times they're just not. But you could literally go in and say, this is what composers do. Like, if you didn't realize this, actually the surprising part about this, and we hadn't talked about this ownership part yet, we will. The film producer, or I'm sorry, the director of a film, all right, the director of a film hires a film composer, work for hire. Right, false or false. Director of a film hires a film composer. That's a work for hire. The film composer hires a what? Orchestra, work for hire, right? That in order to even record the orchestra, we have to have all these engineers. We have to have producers, the whole 9 yards, all work for hires. Funny part about all that is, the director sells that film based upon his contract to a specific studio. So at the end of the day, whoever that studio is has the director as a work for hire, the film composer as a work for hire, the musicians as a work for hire. At the end of the day, they're all compensated in one large chunk, paid up front. That composers could get like a $300,000 fee, which is a good deal if they're only composing for like 2 months. 2 months' work, $300,000. That's a good deal. But depending on who they are, they may never see any more money after that. So like the really interesting part, I always ask myself this because I always want to know. I'd love to know. You know what I mean? I'm at Disneyland, and I'm in the Harry Potter world, and I'm hearing all this Harry Potter music, and I'm going, man, I wonder if John Williams or any of the like 10 different composers that did Harry Potter that are part of the Harry Potter franchise receive any additional compensation for being played at a theme park. Because technically the owner of the copyrighted material there is the film studio. So like they can play it all day and they don't owe anybody any money. And then of course if they license it or if it's streamed or you go buy it, they're the ones that receive the money, right? So like that's why it's such, when they bought Star Wars, all of a sudden we're gonna have Star Wars music playing all over the place at Disneyland. It's like, okay, and I always just wondered, especially for Star Wars, because John Williams was, he was still old. John Williams has been old. I don't know how he could be that old for so long, but he was old when he did Star Wars. But John Williams, even then, though, wasn't like this massive composer yet. He wasn't like, he hadn't really hit that stride yet. So, like, I just wonder how much leverage did he have to go, all right, well, anytime this is ever used in the future, I receive this kind of compensation, you know what I mean, versus, because normal composers were literally work made for hire immediately. Like up front, right away. It's a work for hire, which means they never receive additional compensation. So if that music gets used in a video game and over and over and over again, they don't ever receive extra money from it. So I always wondered about that. You know what I mean? Like he's the only one I wonder about because a lot of the newer ones are already outside the loop, and a lot of the newer ones that are very big, also inside of the contracts just say, look, if you want me to make music for your film, I also need a way to make money for me, so you can pay me less if I do receive some sort of royalty outside of the film, just playing at the theater. Anyway, all that to say, so if you're ever given money to do anything in the realm of music up front, it's typically supposed to be, or they're trying to make it a work for hire. Otherwise, you get paid in the back. And obviously, you can see the problem with that because that means you have to wait for pay, right? But that's part of the deal. For musical arrangements, you can copyright arrangements. The original copyright owner has to still have some role to play. So like what happens is like copyright owner writes a song, they sell it to a publisher. What that publisher will do is the publisher will hire arrangers. Those arrangers could actually own the copyrights for their arrangements, but they're going to sell them back to essentially those arrangements will be sold back to the publisher in terms of like their copyright ownership. So again, it's typically like multiple arrangements will still fall back to the publisher. But they have some specific rights. Their one-time fee is based on the American Federation of Music. Additional rights, royalties, or income, once they fall to the publisher, they're not necessarily giving it to. So like, you could be. This is almost like a staff writer. It's literally essentially a staff arranger. Although most arranger deals are not staff. They're almost like consultants. It's almost like you're a contract employee, your contract arrange stuff that we need arrangements of, all right? So like, hey, look, we need, we need someone to make an arrangement of the Big Bang Theory's
theme song, but we need it done for the pan flute. All right, we need it done by tomorrow. We'll give you a $200 fee for it, and that's all you ever receive. You know, which might not be bad for you if you're just a Sibelius or Finale Wiz, right? So it's not a huge thing. But here's where we get into the meat. Although I didn't see the, oh, I don't see it here. Bummer. Where is it? All right, sorry, this is like a huge, I don't know why it transitioned here this way, but I need to add a little more to this to make this fly. So this is what happens. I want you to write this down, and then we'll take a break. We need to take a break soon. Write this down. Copyrights. There are two types of copyrights. One of them is called the PA. You can just write PA. It's for the performing arts. And the other one is called the SR. And the SR is for, that's what this one is, sound recordings. You can copyright your work at either one of the stages, either as a PA or as an SR. But you have to understand that like typically you want ownership of both, but you don't necessarily have to have it. So like the goal is that if I'm a writer and I write a song, what I'll do is I'll make a recording of it. I'll write out all the lyrics. If I had time to write like the notated form of it, I could. I send that into the copyright office. I file it as a PA. What the PA is that performing arts protects the song. Okay, the performing arts royalty protects the song. Performing arts royalty protects the song. All right? And it's a little different because it just protects the song, where the SR protects the recording of the song. The difference is that,
What is that source name?
sound recording. Yeah. The difference is that the SR protects the recording of the song, so that means if I write the song but you make the recording of it, like you're the artist that records it, me as a writer, I own the PA, but whoever funds your recording owns the SR. And that's usually the label. So the labels always typically own the SR. If I fund my own recording, I own the SR. If I'm my own writer, I own the PA, which means I own the PA and I own the SR. Does that make sense? You can jointly own the SR as well. Sometimes the writers, if they're not, if you're a writer and I'm a performer and I record your song, we might jointly hold the SR. It just typically the SR is typically owned by whoever funds it, and typically they'll pay the writer a license fee to record it. So I made a deal. It's funny. I made a couple deals years ago. When I first got out of college, I had a bunch of songs, and I worked at a studio, and I'd have artists come in all the time and go, "Oh, I need music," and I'd be like, "All right, I'll sell you some music." And now, of course, I wasn't greedy at all, but I was always like, well, if I want the right artist to buy my music, I'm not going to sell it for cheap. So I'd just be like, yeah, you could sell. I'm going to sell you the license to record my music. Right, so bless you. And for the first artist that I had worked with, I sold the license for $2,000 a piece. So like for one song it was $2,000, and they wanted two. So I was like, all right, four grand, awesome. In the deal, I get to keep my rights. They get to license it for a term. They get to keep, because they pay for the license for the period of time, they get SR rights. Right? Does that make sense? Because they pay the license fee, so they get the SR rights for the duration of time. But inside of the deal, they're only allowed to use those license rights for a certain period of time. So once that license expires, essentially I'm not going to do anything with recordings. It doesn't mean the ownership of the recordings falls to me. They still keep the recordings. They just have to relicense them if they want to release them again. Does that make sense? So like if they fail to release them in the window, rights fall back to me, and they have to pay it again if they're going to release it. Then a lot of the artists that I worked with would like come in and pay for songs, and then I just never see them again. So a lot of them just didn't have like a thought out plan of like, okay, well, what do I do next? Which as I learned through the years, it's like I don't do those kinds of deals anymore, because it's like unless someone knows what they're doing and has funding to move forward, they're literally just wasting their money. It's like what's your next plan? So that's what I always ask artists, because I actually had a conference call about someone's artist agreement last week, and they were asking me what I thought about it. And I'm like, dude, this is horrible. Like, what's the next step? You know what I mean? Like the way that the money's outlined, the money doesn't outline anything of what happens after the recording is done. And that's always the thing that I always get frustrated with, because a lot of people understand it takes money to make a good recording, but then they spend all the money on a good recording, and there's no secondary step. There's no marketing plan. There's no pitch, plan. There's no radio promotion. There's nothing to back it up. So like they have this recording and they're just expecting to throw it out into the internet and have people just fall in love with it. But there's not even a marketing pitch for Facebook. Like or Instagram. There's no other kind of scheme going on. So there was a lot of things that I saw in that needed to be worked out. But in the recording process, there's the SR, and in the original work, there's the PA. Does that make sense? With the PA-SR, that happens a lot of times is that, like, the cool part about the PA versus the SR, and this is what I like about it, I file a PA as a writer immediately. But if I go into the studio and some guitar player's like, oh, I like this lick over this song, and I didn't write it, his rights are split out on the SR. If I put him if he's not a work for hire, his rights are split on the SR. We share the SR. So normally what I would do, like when I was writing for my band heavily, me as a writer, I owned all the PAs. And then us as a team, we jointly owned all the SR. Does that make sense? So like us as a group, as a team, we jointly own all the SR. But the cool part about owning the PA independently means that if I wanted to go record the whole thing with somebody else, I can do it because I own the PA, which is the right to then go reproduce that song in a recorded medium, and then I can own that SR with that group. Does that make sense? So it gives you the freedom to do that. Whereas if your PAs were jointly filed and they were all done jointly, you'd always be tied to that group. Like that's what's always very difficult with copyright. It's like saying, oh yeah, we wrote the song, but I want you guys to give me permission to go record it with this other group of people. You know what I mean? There's a lot of people kind of have some reservations about it. Okay, so we talk about this a little later, but this one's a bit of a tough one. This falls under, I would just draw a big line and say, this is outside of copyright conversation, but this becomes our first stop when we talk about why copyright ownership is so important. This is the first license information that you see. This is called the compulsory mechanical. This is one of the major licenses that you're going to see and we're going to kind of have a conversation about. But this is the license, essentially, once the first recordings are produced. Licensing begins being granted to other individuals to record the same song. So like covers are done, a lot of them are done through compulsory mechanical license. This talks about special conditions, but the biggest one is that only minor changes are allowed, and the copyright must be given notice of the intent of the work. So like if I'm going to use a compulsory mechanical license to re-record somebody else's song by doing a cover, I have to only make minor changes and I have to notify the original writer or publisher. The real big difference is, like if I'm going on YouTube and I've just got my acoustic guitar and I'm going to cover somebody's song, that's not considered a real release. So that's why it's not so heavily restricted. Most artists just don't care because they get their money through that anyway. They get paid. YouTube, like what YouTube does is they recognize that it's a song that's owned by somebody else through the copyright protection, and then they pay the PRO to pay that individual. So like literally the money still ends up funneling back to the original owner of the copywritten work. This is really specifically if I'm going to release like a major album on a major release with a major record label, this is when these conditions really apply. The downside to this, and you'll read about this a little bit later, in the compulsory, which is why it's called compulsory, notice of intent must be provided. But notice that there's not a provision that says that the original owner has to approve. And in this kind of mechanical license, it's a very expensive mechanical license to pay, but it literally allows for, like, if you have the money to license someone else's music that published it without their consent, all you have to do is notify them of your specific intent. Now, in a real-world scenario, if someone really does not want you to use their music, their next move is to hire a lawyer. And they actually have the right to pursue you legally. And a lot of times they'll try to get some sort of injunction to block your ability to release something under the compulsory mechanical license. There's a couple of different ways to do that. Most of the time, the artists or like record labels will avoid the compulsory because it literally is like I'm literally taking the music from you kind of thing. Even though I'll pay you for the license, but I'm doing it without your real consent.
which is kind of a dirty play. So there's a bunch of other license means that are available. This one's usually only done under certain circumstances. But let's just talk about the royalty payments overall. And so when we go back to the copyright ownership, copyright ownership is so important specifically because it will outline who gets paid in general. It doesn't outline who gets paid what amount, but whoever owns the copyright essentially receives the royalty. And if the person that owns the copyright is a record label, they receive the royalty on the artist's behalf, and they pay out to the artist, and then they also pay out to the writers based upon whatever deal they have. The royalty rates are actually set by a specific statute, but what's really interesting is in the modern day record agreements, there's a clause that actually limits or has a threshold that you agree to when you sign it that allows them to pay you only a certain percentage of that rate instead of paying you full rate, which is kind of an underhanded thing, but they put it in there, and a lot of people just kind of go with it, because it's a lot of times when you're handed, the hard part is as an artist, when you're handed a record deal, you're looking at it going, I can either make no money like I am right now, or little money like I am right now, or I can jump into this deal that might not be great, but it also has some money in it. So some artists just kind of go, you can have it, that little bit of percentage that I'm not going to get. But the other thing about this is owners must be identified through the Copyright Office records, and this is where it becomes important. You can't technically receive money from the PROs unless you filed your copyright. You can't receive your royalties technically unless the copyright has been filed. All right, so that's the key element to what this is trying to say is that it's not allowed, and through the PROs, they won't even validate your claim of ownership to your music without a copyright in hand. So how do we fix that? I always just say, if you're a writer, if you're working with writers, it's part of the flow. If you guys, how many of you were thinking of doing something in music business like music management? Music management? Music management? Is anybody thinking, someday I might run a label, or a production company, or a publishing company, or anything like that? If you're going to do any business realms of that, the first thing you always have to tell your artists is, in order to own more of what they make, they need to file their copyrights early. File the copyrights early, own them early, and update them. Because whoever owns a copyright, if you're realizing this whole thing that we've been talking about today, whoever owns a copyright owns the money, right? Whoever owns a copyright is entitled to the funding. And some elements like the PROs don't recognize you as owning it unless you literally have the copyright in hand. So, and this is how they do it. When I signed up for my PROs, it's funny, when you're on your PRO, you actually have to establish, if you're about to have a release, you have to go put a register in and say, hey, I'm going to have an album out tomorrow. And then when you do it, it's going to say, well, what are the titles of the works? And then immediately after it says, what is the registration ID number of each work? And you literally throw that in. And without that, they don't have the ability to validate that that's your work. Because you could literally go, oh yeah, I have a release tomorrow. Me and my band, One Republic, right? We have a release tomorrow. Here are the songs, right? There are people that do that, but without the copyright ID, there's no ownership, right? There's actually even some artists that go do that. They have a record deal, but they go do that to see if they can find a way to get their pay without having to go through the record label. But you know what I mean? So there's weird stuff that happens. This one's a huge thing. This is part of the information that you need to know about the copyright. And we talked a little bit about this before. You don't need to know this. I'm not super interested in this. But if you go down here, and this was just part of that transition, this is where it matters now. This is where we are now. You can see how that kind of provision changed. After the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act in 1998, the duration of the copyright is extended to 70 years beyond the death of the author. Okay, which again, if you live to be an old person, is a long time, right? If you're Kurt Cobain, technically he doesn't own anything. Why doesn't Kurt Cobain own anything?
He signed with a record label.
Yeah, because he was in a record contract with a publishing deal. So he technically doesn't own the copyright, but because he was the the performer or songwriter, in his contract, his estate still earns money, and it gets paid from the record label. It gets paid from the publishing company after they get paid. Yes.
So let's say you have connections to get your stuff out there in the industry, or let's say you have a song that blows up, and you're not signed with any label, and you're pretty much doing it by yourself. The best way to make money would be to obviously organically like get fans and organically put yourself on your own performances and just have your music distributed through, like, I know people can put their own music on Apple Music and stuff like that. So
yeah.
is that the best way to go? Because this is a lot of
Like you're giving away a lot to,
Yeah,
to the other entities. Yeah, it just depends on at what value. I always say the best way to make money, of course, is to go to radio. So like if you're like, hey, what's my instructor's theme on how to make money in the music business? Go to radio. Like your first goal, go to radio. That in going to radio, like this is what radio professionals typically say. You can't just go up to them and say, hey, I have an album, or hey, I have a release. You normally have to hire a radio promoter, but outside of that, the thing that they're looking for is they're looking, like most radio professionals go, are you happening right now? Where are you at right now? What are you doing right now? Where are you touring right now? How recent is your album? And if you can make that align timing-wise so that the release coincides with a radio tour, coincides with an actual tour, coincides with all that happening inside of a short window, because radio play happens typically within the first 3 months of a release, and then it's gone. Does that make sense? It's like outside of that first 3 months of a release, it's too late. So you do it all in the prep stage. So what we, like when I was an artist and we were touring, we would literally do a radio press before release to promote ourselves. We go do that same radio tour once more or like right around the release. And that radio tour coincides with the actual performance tour. Because Boston's not going to play you if you're not going to be performing in Boston.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they look at it and go, that's just doesn't happen. But once you go to radio, you're exposed to thousands of people that then can go online and go, oh, now I want to go look at you on Apple Music, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I always say, hey, that's the best way. I do believe in an organic approach. There's a lot of artists that, it was huge when I was coming up, that bought their way through certain phases. Without the organic approach, though, you don't have a real audience. And the audience loyalty is very, very slim. It doesn't translate as well. Does that make sense? So, like, you really do have to, you can't just go, because did you know that you could go buy your YouTube plays? You know, a lot of people probably just assume that. But, yeah, you can go buy millions of YouTube plays on your own. You could go, you know, by tomorrow you could have 10 million YouTube video views, right? You can go pay for it. You literally could go pay for it.
Can you make money off of that?
Yeah, he would make money off of that. Technically, you pay for it, and you make money off of it because of the views. But the problem is, that's not an organic fan development, which means that like you couldn't just go out and perform a show tomorrow and expect to have that kind of a return. You couldn't even probably expect to have 100 people at your performance tomorrow without the organic approach to that. Does that make sense? So I agree with the use of the word organic is super important in that element. So I always suggest for artists, if you're new and you're doing it organically on your own and you don't want to do all this, pick a city, pick a region. Does that make sense? Pick a city, pick a region. Do it, and do it, and do it, and do it again. You know what I mean? Like, it's interesting. When I was busy and I was doing it here, everybody knew who we were. You know what I mean? And like people knew who I was, and I never knew. I was so bad with names. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't that kind of person. But like people always knew who we were. You know what I mean? We'd have our face on a billboard, like literally, or we'd have our face on a marquee, and that's what you have to do to your saturated city first. You know what I mean? Like you saturate the city first, and then you go to the region. And you do the same thing with the region until people in that region know you by name. Even if that means you're just playing house parties. We played lots of house parties, and they were huge. I mean, they would be so big. You go to a house party, and because of the direct correlation and the connection and the vibe with people, all of them would buy your album.
Yeah.
Versus going to a show where you might be opening up for somebody else, and then the return would they don't necessarily get. So, but you have to build in the region till they're sick of you, and then you have no choice to move on to the next region or to go to the East Coast. You know what I mean? Like, you have to build it that way. If you don't build it that way, like that, I'd say that was one of the biggest mistakes I made as an artist. Is I jumped off of California before we were done with it. You know what I mean? Like, we did California for like 2 months, and then we were like, all right, let's go to the East Coast. We hit the East Coast, and we're like, nobody knows us there. You know what I mean? Like, we're on the radio out here, but like nobody knows us there. We go play a show in Illinois, and we have 1,000 people show up just for us that we've never met before. But as soon as we go to Massachusetts, it's like we got 20 people that maybe knew who we were. Not the same vibe, not the same following, not the same.
Getting on the radio, does the radio? I know the radio organization. They have something where. So pretty much, they send you a check. Is that how you make the money, or is that just the publicity that it eventually makes you money?
No, they send the money to the PROs. The PROs send you the money. But, I mean, that's, for me, I could look at it and go, I made thousands of dollars performing, but out of the thousands of dollars that I made performing, like when you're on the road and you're out there performing and you're making money, you always spend it. Like, it's always spent. And there's always something to spend it on. Sometimes that just means, hey, we want a nicer hotel for the night, or we want, real meals for the night, or there's bills to pay, that kind of stuff. But when I got paid from radio, that's the money that I spent on cool stuff. You know what I mean? That was like the extra chunk of change that I was able to keep. You know what I mean? Like, because it's still thousands of dollars. You know what I mean?
A lot.
But yeah, but the cool part about it is like when you receive it, you're not like necessarily like, I remember the first check I got, I was sitting at home on my couch after a tour, and here comes our first check. Why? Because it's 90 days after the close of the quarter. So like when I finally quit the band, for 2 years after, I received checks. You know what I mean? Like reasonable checks for 2 years after. I still receive royalty payments now, but they're not. My royalty payments now may be like $100, or you know what I mean? Like, that might be a typical royalty payment. That's not much. Let's see, we're now, yeah, it's 7 years after I quit, Now, if I signed to a publishing company, though, now that's the difference there. If I had signed to a publishing company, there would be more royalties, and there would be more royalties. I could expect more royalties in the next 20 years. Does that make sense? So, like, even though I have to give it away, if I give my rights away to a publishing company and they like the music and they continue to produce it and do something with it, I could still be sitting on the couch making royalty checks. Not my music, or it's my music on the radio, but not my performance on the radio. You see what I'm saying? Because they're going to go promote that. I mean, they could use my performance on the radio if someday there's like a, oldie station that plays music from the 2010s, which is kind of a weird face, but you know what I mean? Like, that would make sense. But yeah, so it's like you do have to kind of look at the give and the take. The record deal that we made, though, and I was very I was very picky and choosy on that one. I always tell people, we haven't gotten to record contracts, but when you make a record deal, you're signing into debt, is literally what you're doing. So like, you are going to give your copyrights away. The big thing is you're signing into debt because they're going to make you a dollar amount deal, and it's not, you know what I mean? Like, it's a dirty world out there. Like, they're not giving you this money for no reason. You know what I mean? Like, they're not going to go, hey, here's your money, just because, it's not like being a basketball star where like when you finally arrive into that realm that you earned that money. You know what I mean? Like, you're entitled to that money because you earned it throughout that entire time. And you go play a few games, and if you're injured, it's kind of cool. It's not too big of a deal. You know what I mean? Like, they could technically still owe you money even if you don't play a game. It's like a totally opposite end of the spectrum where it's like they don't look at it like that. It's like the minute they sign that deal, you owe them that money back. Like, does that make sense? So like, whether you make that money for them, or you don't make that money for them, or you make more than that money for them, all changes what they do with you after that phase, like what they do with you during that phase. So I agree. What I always tell artists is you sign the deals that you're ready for. Does that make sense? So like, if you think about it as I'm signing a debt, you don't go sign $1 million deal because you don't have $1 million. You know what I mean? Like, what kind of collateral do you have? A lot of artists, I remember when I was an artist, I was like, oh, the only collateral I have is my car, right? Until I was out on the road and someone came and picked it up and took it away. Right? And then all of a sudden I was like, oh yeah, okay, well, I don't have any collateral at all anymore. That's it. That was it. I didn't really own it anyway, so it's gone. So
And that was a rude awakening. I was out on the road making money, but I wasn't being very responsible because, you're kind of away from home. So I wasn't paying bills. I wasn't, there's a lot of stuff I wasn't doing because I was just out there having fun, And that was an interesting day. My car gets repossessed, and I'm like, well, I have the money. I just hadn't gotten to it yet. And I just, for the last 6 months, of course, I just kind of been focusing on, because I'm out on the road. I'm like, well, if I'm making money, I want to buy a new guitar. I want to buy a new amp. I want to buy, I wanted to be able to do all that kind of stuff. I just wasn't doing it wisely. But the real interesting part about that is like, you've signed the deal that you're ready for, because if you're not, you would know it if you're on the precipice of signing a major deal. So the cool part about that is you could technically, I know you're talking about doing it organically, you could technically sign a small deal. You know what I mean? Like you could technically, with a smaller record label, sign a smaller deal that just provides just enough funding for you to get over the hump. Does that make sense? Yeah. Or you could take out a loan, but a lot of artists are not in any position to take out loans, so that's always like, because that's what people always say, well, why can't I just take out a loan? If I'm only looking at borrowing like 50 grand or 60 grand, why can't I just take out a loan? Well, that's pretty obvious because, what we've been doing financially over the last few years. Most musicians are not great with that. So what they do, of course, is they sign with a small, they call it a development deal, a small label that'll get them through that transition. Now let's talk about just a couple of things. One of the things is, I do want to talk about infringement. The word infringement, if you haven't heard it before, copyright infringement, that just means it's the same thing as plagiarism, really. It is plagiarism for the music realm, okay? So like this one's a big deal because this is where people lose their money. If you there's a lot of copyright infringement lawsuits that are still out there right now. What's that guy's name? One of the more recent was Pharrell Williams was sued for copyright infringement, and he actually lost that case. And one of the interesting things about that is you can actually be sued, and that was in his instance. What happened was they went into the studio and they were like, "We want this song to have this kind of feel," and they literally modeled that feel off of a song that was already created from a long time ago. And so, and I forget who. I think it was Marvin Gaye, and I think it was the family of Marvin Gaye that brought the lawsuit on. So they literally were like, "This is like a direct. It wasn't note for note infringement, but like if you were to side by side them, it didn't have like if you side by side them, they weren't like completely identical. But like if you like hummed it to yourself and heard it in your head." And then you went to the other song and you hummed it to yourself and heard it in your head, you go, wow, these are like really close together. But when you line them up completely, there's things that are different about them. Court of law ruled that there was enough there to have a lawsuit from. So of course, the artists that can commit the infringement pay a large sum of money in a big chunk to whoever they infringed upon for damages. And that happens a lot. The goal, I think, in most cases, the goal of the record company, it's the responsibility of the record company to not only just go to their artist and go, is this original, yes or no? Is it 100% original, yes or no? But the record company actually hires individuals who listen to the music and focus on the music and try to find, is there anything legally that puts us at risk? Does that make sense? So like they literally have specialists that focus on, does this sound too much like anything that exists that could put us at risk? And things still happen and slip through the cracks, all the time. Infringement, of course, is what they call it when you break the law for copyright. A lot of you can see the remedies: injunction, impoundment, destruction, damages. It just depends on who, where, when, and why. I know one guy. It's so funny. I know this guy, real cool guy, and his rights were infringed upon. And it's very interesting, his story, because he like literally took his work direct to a publisher, and he has like all these deal memos that they set up with him. But the person he was working with got fired, so they dropped his deal. And then 2 years later, they literally released his work. And they released it under their own publishing brand from one of the publishing writers that works for them. And he's like, this is like this is like verbatim what I gave them.
And he said, but I'm not suing now. You know, I'm suing next year after they're done with the life cycle of the product they just released. And so there are a couple different approaches to it. You could impound, notice impoundment, destruction. You could impound and destruct, you know, or destroy, right? You could send out a cease and desist, right? But a lot of artists and companies realize that that's not the best play for infringement. The best play for infringement is let it play out, let it do its thing, and then you sue. Because then the dollar amount isn't about the damages that could have been, right? It's the actual damages that do exist. Like you could literally put a dollar amount on how much they owe you. Does that make sense? So sometimes that happens. You know, it's actually really sad. But I mean, I'll say this, you know, almost every major artist has had to deal with this particular element in one way, shape, or form. You know, because there's a lot of people there's a lot of music out there. I always tell people, if you want to be 100% original, protect yourself from listening to too much other music, to be honest. You know what I mean? I always encourage people to listen to something outside of the realm of what you're going to do. You know what I mean? Because if you wanted to be John Mayer and have a John Mayer sound, and all you do is listen to John Mayer, and then when you write your John Mayer songs, they're going to sound like John Mayer, and it's essentially going to end up falling really close to this line. Instead, you want to sound like John Mayer, go listen to something else that inspires you and use that as your inspiration for how you're going to have that sound, and then that's how you end up with a uniquely original work. You know, that's how a lot of the really cool artists that you go look to, they don't just sound like someone else that was already there. A lot of times they're like some sort of fusion of this plus that, right? And that's what makes them unique. So that I always find it very important. Actually, that's about it there. Okay, so sorry, I wanted to talk about one other thing. All right, sorry, I know we need to take a break. Let's just take like a quick 2-minute break, and we'll jump back in and jam because it's already almost 8:30. I don't know how it got so late already. Did anybody else have papers to turn in? Did anybody else submit them to Canvas and Canvas only? No. Did you happen to be able to log in?
No.
Enroll? Okay. Maybe show it to me real quick. You know what? No, I didn't put it out. Thank you for reminding me. I totally left him in my car, so I'm just gonna toss this. Hey, Brandon, or is he still here? Oh, that's hilarious. They're gonna kick out of the back of it. You just throw the date on there, sign in. Thank you for reminding me.
He told me to look at the back of the sign machine. It was like a laugh. Well, I was yeah, we all this was my this. Well, I don't remember the script. It was great. I did all the music and stuff. It was like a music. It was like a
Okay.
Yeah, it's just the app. I'm gonna guess I'm gonna just actually sign it.
Oh wait, let me see. Is it? What's it doing?
Like I have it pulled up.
What is so valuable?
Yeah.
I heard it.
Yeah, it was in the browser. But when I go to the app,
Oh,
it
I was
shows.
talking about something different.
That's
crazy.
Yeah.
Did everybody sign in?
No.
Yeah, I think you will have to do that. I'm sorry, bud. I mean, I haven't used it. You know, I know that when I sign into the app, it won't even let me get in as a teacher on the app side. So I just added it to my home screen, you know, as a web link.
Yeah, that's what I. Oh, actually, I can do that.
This is so much power.
Okay. Okay, so on screen, this is the Library of Congress website. And you can see right here, you can gain access to a couple of different things. But from here, you could go specifically to the copyright.gov resource. I always suggest if, like, for those of you who are kind of learning or new to copyright, some copyright basics, there's a lot of really cool stuff here for in terms of resources. You know, there's like a whole list of frequently asked questions. But you can actually download the copyright forms. When I was a kid and I was like first filing copyrights, I mean all the way up till like 5 years ago, we were still all doing registrations via paper. Now they're all done online finally, so they finally caught up to that. And there was even a weird phase where you could do it online, but then you still had to physically mail your stuff in, and they did away with that as well. So you can see there's a register, record a document, research, and certify. when you go in here for the first time to register a copyright, like that's what they call it. The first time you're filing a copyright is a registration of a copyright. And you literally will log into this online portal. I don't remember my credentials. I wish I had them because they're actually very specific and it's a series of weird numbers. But maybe next week if I go home and if I remember to pull that information, I can show that to you. I mean, the portal is really basic. Like you literally, it's kind of an interesting process, but you literally do the form, you like file the form, and then what you do is you file the form, you upload the media, it has to be accepted. So they do this like pre-screening process to make sure like it works basically, that like, once they do that and legitimize that and they validate it, then you pay the fee. And then you still end up waiting 6 months for the certificate to come in. Now, what I always suggest when filing for a copyright registration, it's kind of an interesting rule that I have, always have the registrations mailed to a secure and consistent mailing address. And what that means is when I first started doing these in college, when I first moved away, I realized, hey, it's not going to work. I mean, it's going to take 6 months for me to get them. My dorm room is here this semester, and it's going to change by the time I receive them, right? So the first time, actually, I still ended up trying to send it to school. It wasn't received. My first certificate while I was away, it didn't get received. So after that, I realized, you know what? I just need to send it to my original boyhood home where my father still lives and will live until the day he dies, because it's just an easy location to send stuff to. Even if you're if you establish a business or whatever, you have a business address or PO you're going to hold long term, that's important. But the interesting part about it is that you can't, when you file the form, unlike a lot of other locations, you can't just log in and make a change of address. When you file the form, the address that's put in the initial filing is the address that they send correspondence to. So like if you moved 3 months from now and you hadn't yet received, you can't just send a request for it to be moved or sent. It'll literally be sent to whatever address it held at that particular given time, which is a huge flaw in the system, of course, but it's something that we've all dealt with for many, many years. So I always just say, hey, send it to a secure address that it's going to be received by someone that's going to actually be there that represents you. But this is kind of it's still kind of old school looking. But what's really interesting about that is you can actually go in here. There's a bunch of stuff that you can learn. You can actually go in here. Where's the database? And search copyright records. So like if you were wondering who owns the copyright for, whatever it is you're looking for, you literally will do a search by, and this one's by title. You can do a search by name, you can do a search by keywords. Mine always come up weird. So like if I do my own search, mine come up weird because actually I don't know if it'll come up this way. Some of my real name is James. Oh, actually, you probably don't even know the name that I go by. I don't know if you ever did. Yeah, Vince. I go by Vince, right? I don't know if I told you guys that, but my real first name is James. So like some stuff is under James. My middle name is Vincent. But if I search I know, right? But if I search my full name, let's see. Nothing came up. But if I go under. Let me go under this. Keyword. Yeah, I know, right? Oh, okay, yeah, these are all mine. All the way up until this one. These are all my really old ones from when I was a kid. 1998. What was I doing in 1998? I was 17. No, I was 16. I'm sorry. I was 16 the first filing that I did.
I was 2.
Right? Yeah, exactly. But you could see these are all all of these are catalogs. These are catalogs. These are all in portfolio catalogs. So if you open them up, this one's the one that's huge, I think. Oh yeah, there they are. Boom, 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 boom. It shows each listing, but it doesn't search for them effectively. So if I'm oh man, where did I do the filing for I Don't Want You? This one actually is, the reason this was filed as such a large log is because this was all the backlog of things that I never used during one of my writing seasons. And I actually, it's really 2 writing seasons. So this is about a 2-year span of stuff that I had never filed. It just wasn't on the top tier stuff that I was I'm going to for sure use. But I was I'm doing a filing of a bunch of other compositions. So I went ahead and just threw them all in there. But you can see they're just alphabetized. And this was a really hard file to submit. it still only costs a $35 fee, just a one fee to do it as one big file, but it was a hard one to submit because it won't let you submit until each one of these audio pieces is matched up with its title. So you literally have to, when you establish a title, you write all the details about the title, there's a lot of stuff you put in each one, and then you have to take that title and attach the song, and then move on to the next title and attach the song. So like this was several days worth of filing. But I mean, this is where all that stuff's logged, you know, and you can see, like after a while, when I'm composing, you see some of the stuff from 2012. Well, a lot of times when I was composing, I would just do like the date, the theme, the date, the theme, the date, the theme. Some of that would get translated into future use, and some of that stuff would just, you know, kind of be there for my portfolio. So like, because after a while, like I don't know, any of you composers in the room, like after a while when you're composing stuff, you're like, man, I'm just composing, and like there's so much creative juice flowing that it's like I don't know, I don't have a title for it. You know what I mean? Like when I was working on a couple films, there were a couple actual films that were in there that I had compositions from, and they actually had film titles, and they actually had actual scene titles, and those scene titles were translated into song titles. But some of these were like, 418 was a big day for me. 418, theme 1 through 12, right? I mean, and that's all theme 1 through 12. The weird part about this is you can't push play on these, right? That's the only other weird element. You can't just go, oh, I wonder what this is, and push play on it. They don't let you do that. Like, you can only actually see the filing for it. You'd actually have to be able to have a resource or a place to go find the actual song, which is kind of weird. But, you know, I mean, again, it's probably good because at least it protects your work. But, yeah, you can see all this stuff. This was one of the films that I composed for, and this one has like its own catalog. You know, some of these I did not fire. Notice it says at all. This is a new system of the filing, so like these all mean that they're catalogs, but these ones are catalogs too. So I don't know why they added that extension on these ones. That's a newer thing, but you could see, you know, they're rated by relevance. You know, but again, it's kind of an interesting thing because you'll always forever be able to like see like which date you filed for over here. And I think the one weird part that was very interesting about this, let's see 4 weeks. Let's see what this one says. Oh yeah, okay. So like this one's a co-write. This is a co-write. Me, and it shows my date of birth. Stephanie Smith, date of birth. Fernando, date of birth. So like when you do these kinds of copyrights, and this one was for when I was with a band called Flint, you know, and it says, you know, the publishing was owned by Flint, 2003, and these are the individual members. Well, the problem with this is that when we file as a joint for a co-write, if I want to do anything with this work, we all own it, right? So like I have to have exclusive permission from everybody in order to be able to move forward with something for this. So like the only other thing you could do is you could extract your own work from it, but the particular filing that's here is an SR. So like a lot of times all the SRs are filed as a joint because there's multiple people on it when you're in a band. So like that's how these are represented here. So you can see how that's set up. And of course, description, compact disc, you know, everything was that back then in that era. Yeah.
Would work for hires still be on there?
No, because they don't get an inclusion for. Well, I'm sorry. There is a provisional section that you can add your work for hires on the copyright form, but work for hires are not required to be on there because they're technically bought and paid for. So a lot of times, people do not include them, which is really sad. You know, not as sad these days because at least work for hires have future opportunities. But like, it's funny because I actually met this guy. I met this guy that was the backup guitar player for Elvis like years ago when I was a kid, and he came to our school and he was telling us his story, and he was a work for hire, you know, the whole time, and they literally would put Elvis out on the stage and they would have him sit backstage and play all his parts, and it's like, yeah, I got paid, you know, but it's, you know what I mean, like I was literally just behind the scenes. No one ever knew that I existed. You know, the goal was to not know that I existed. You know what I mean? Because it was supposed to be Elvis, right? Like that was the persona of Elvis. But he's like, but Elvis couldn't move around like that at all in a live performance if he was actually playing, you know, because of the stuff that he would do. You know, so like they would hire a band and the band would play with them, and I was the guy that sat off on the side or the back of the stage, and no one got to see that played for his parts, literally from top to bottom. I just listened to the band and I just play with them.
So his instrument was turned off.
Yeah, well, yeah, in most cases, not even connected to anything at all. Yeah, very interesting thing. But again, you know, I mean, so like, but guys like that, you know, who he was a work for hire on a lot of Elvis's albums, don't get the recognition from that era. But a lot of the people that are in it now do, you know, because they kind of, you know, people don't like that as much, and so they don't usually get involved in those kinds of deals. But like this is copyright. This is how the copyright process works. So you file it, you publish, you know, you put this out. I think even then, bless you. Oh yeah, I had a release. Interestingly enough, where is it? Is it on this one? Oh yeah, yeah. I had a release in 2015 that actually got filed in 2013, and it's in here. So like it's really interesting because I was just looking at it, going, oh, where's my 2015 release? But I just forgot I did file it early. Sometimes that happens. I mean, like I like to file stuff as soon as it's ready. Like if it's ready enough, it's a done song, and I have them batched, just send them. You know, I don't file as much as I need to, but according to the way that the Library of Congress sees it, again, your works are copywritten the minute you created them. It's just it's the burden of proof lies on you to be able to prove that it's your own original work created